Chapter 9. Organizing the Lumber and Construction Workers. The impression, created by newspaper accounts, that the IWW was exclusively a free speech organization was far from the truth. While the organization was conducting a vigorous fight for free speech, filling the jails of Spokane, Fresno, San Diego and many other cities, Wobblies were active in the lumber and construction camps, organizing the workers and mobilizing them to strike against low wages, long hours, and uncivilized working conditions. Conditions in lumber industry. In dealing with the lumber industry, the IWW quickly learned that there were two fairly distinct, though interrelated, groups of workers employed by the timber companies: the mill workers and the lumberjacks. The sawmill worker lived in or near towns Seattle, Portland, Spokane, Aberdeen, Hoquiam, Everett, Centralia, Marshfield, Eureka, and other towns and cities of the Northwest and California where major mills were located. He was usually married, with children, and lived in the town where he worked. Life for the millman was stable as long as the mill remained in operation. His work was regulated, he worked indoors, and when his day was done, he would return home. His wages were higher than the lumberjacks, but the work, though certainly not harder than in the woods, was monotonous, with speed being the principal prerequisite. The lumberjack lived in camps, which, as timber cutting increased, were located farther and farther from the cities and towns. The logger usually got to a city only once or twice during the year and then only for a 4 or 5 day spree, which sent him back to the camp a poor man or forced him to travel by side door coach to different areas where jobs 214 might be available. In either case, it might be another 6 months before he returned again to the town. During the better part of the year, the logger lived in a hastily constructed camp in the woods, located 20 or 30 miles from the nearest town, isolated except for a logging road. Women and children were seldom, if ever, present. Generally speaking, the logger was an immigrant from Northern and Eastern Europe, a single man, unhindered by the concerns of family life and, unlike the mill worker, able and willing at any moment to quit work and move on to a new job or no job at all. The conditions under which the logger worked were notoriously bad. The men lived in bunkhouses which averaged 100 feet in length and 20 in width. Each building housed 50 to 100 men. The men's bunks were not arranged horizontally along the walls, but were instead placed side by side, with the occupant's head facing the center aisle. As this arrangement resembled a stable, the men were forced to climb into their bed feet first. The bunks were referred to as stalls. Each man had approximately 3 square feet of breathing space. The beds had neither mattresses nor straw, but consisted of several planks nailed together. Blankets, sheets, and pillowcases were rarely supplied by the lumber companies. The men ordinarily carried their own blankets. Lice infested every camp, the companies seldom bothering to exterminate them. When the living quarters were cleaned, it was the men themselves who did the work. Camps dirty, badly drained, poorly ventilated, crowded, unsanitary and generally vermin-ridden, with no facilities for bathing or for washing clothes, was a contemporary description. Another contemporary described the typical camps as relics of barbarism, more like cattle pens than the habitations of civilized men in the 20th century. One former logger recalled, "When I worked in the woods we were packed into bunkhouses like sardines. You had to be an acrobat to get into your bunk. There were no bathing facilities in the camps and the camps were so lousy, the louses were lousy. Can you imagine, men were actually carrying their whole households on their backs while they were looking for jobs." 1. Each bunkhouse contained 2 stoves, placed at either end of the building. During the winter, when the temperatures commonly dropped to below zero, this arrangement became unbearable. Those lumberjacks sleeping near the stove suffered from the tremendous heat, while those in the middle of the bunkhouse shivered with cold. Loggers worked in all kinds of weather and oftentimes returned to camp in soaked clothes. Over half the camps as late as 1917 had no facilities for bathing or for drying clothes. 2 of the men ate supper sitting in wet clothes. The food was abominable. The standard meal-ls were either beans or pancakes for breakfast, mulligan stew for lunch, and a combination of both for supper. Each man was charged from 90 cents to $1.25 per day for his board, the amount being deducted from his wages. Meals were prepared in the camp's cook shack. In many cases, when a professional cook was unavailable, the company simply designated any man available regardless of experience. Needless to say, few cooks, professional or amateur, could do much with the food provided by the company. A logger recalls, "I saw quarters of condemned beef being served to lumbermen. I remember watching one cook making stew. He had his face turned away from the pot in order to keep from smelling the rotten meat." That was in 1912. 3. The cook shack was as unsanitary as the bunkhouse. Food decomposed in the heat and flies landed anywhere. The lumberjack's daily schedule was rigorous. The men usually arose at 4 a.m. to the foreman's call. Roll out or roll up, get out of bed or roll up your blanket and leave camp. After dressing by the light of a kerosene lamp, the men ate breakfast in the dining room adjacent to the cook shack. By 5 o'clock they had started the long walk to the cutting area, sometimes a distance of several miles. After working for 10 hours, they walked back to camp, arriving there after dark. Thus, though the working day was supposed to last 10 hours, in reality it often stretched to 12. For his labor, a lumberjack received from $2.25 to $1.50 a day. Out of his wages he had to pay a hospital fee of $1 to $1.50 per month. The fee was to cover expenses for hospitalization and other medical care for the loggers. The type of work, hazardous at all times, gave the lumber industry a death rate second only to that in the mines and higher than that of the First World War. On the face of it, the small medical fee providing insurance against injury should have met with favorable reaction from the lumberjacks. Actually, it was a chief grievance of the workers. The failure of the companies to provide adequate medical facilities, either in camps or hospitals, made the fee a token payment for services never rendered. Numerous examples could be cited of men crippled permanently because of the failure of company doctors and hospitals to provide adequate attention. Often doctors were not doctors at all, but men hired by the companies to play the role. 4. In order to obtain work, a prospective logger literally had to buy his job. Some men were able to find work in the various camps by themselves, but in most cases the lumberjack secured a job through a local employment agency. These agencies were either independent business organizations or controlled by the timber firms. Invariably a man ended up at an employment agency where he paid from $1 to $5 to the agent, who gave him a slip of paper entitling him to a job. Without such credentials a lumber worker was commonly refused work by the camp foreman. The employment shark worked with the foreman, giving the latter a kickback for every man he hired. Gang system, whereby there was always one gang coming, one working, and the third going back to town to buy more jobs from the employment shark. The system resulted in increased commissions to employment sharks who split the profits with the cooperating foreman. The men, having spent their money, were left in a strange area, broke, with no chance of redress against the shark. A bitter complaint of the lumberjack was that he never had any job security. He could be fired without reason, or, after having walked to the camp from the agency, be refused a job even though he had purchased a work slip. Situated in thinly settled forest regions, the men lived in a peculiar mixture of capitalism and feudalism, civilization and barbarism, ruled by a foreman who had the power of a petty czar. A get the hell out of here philosophy was to too great an extent in vogue when any of the men complained about the conditions. 11. The following terse comment by the British Columbia Federationist, though it referred to Canada, could just as well be applied to the United States. If there ever was a class of workmen who needed organization, that class is the lumberjacks engaged in the timber industry. 6. The life of the sawmill operator, though better than that of his brother in the logging camps, was far from good. The workers and their families in the mill towns lived in houses rather than barracks, but oftentimes these, too, were inferior in quality. Built of wood, frequently covered with tar paper, the homes were arranged in blocks, accessible by roads which turned into quagmires in the spring. Working conditions in the mills were little better than in the woods. Although a mill worker received higher wages for his effort, and physical exertion was less strenuous than in the woods, boredom was at a maximum because of the repetitious nature of his job. For 10 hours each day a man stood beside a whirling, razor-sharp saw with instantaneous death his constant companion because the timber firms failed to supply safety devices on their machinery. Accident rates were exceedingly high and newspapers carried weekly reports of deaths and maimings. Down at the mill. For this $1 per month hospitalization fee, the mill worker received inadequate care. Factory doctors and nurses were unknown and frequently mill towns were unable to support a hospital. Small wonder that even a spokesman for the lumber industry wrote, "Shingle weaving is not a trade, it is a battle." 7. By the time the WW was organized in 1905, working conditions in the lumber industry were worse than they had ever been. The shift of the industry from the comparatively small and easy-to-fell trees of the Great Lakes to the giant firs of Washington and Oregon and the redwoods of California, and to a lesser extent to the pine areas of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas brought with it many new methods in logging. Huge corporations, dominated by absentee owners, new inventions which speeded up the work and displaced many workers by making their traditional skills obsolete, new methods of logging which established a sort of mobile factory in the woods, a maze of cables, engines, pumps, saws, rails, locomotive cars, trucks, power plants, and chains, all produced fabulous profits for the employers. But the workers in the logging camps and mill towns shared little of this prosperity. Their wages had hardly risen, and their living conditions had deteriorated. In 1905, woodsmen were putting in 10 to 12 hours time a day and MHL men 10 hours. Prior to 19%, no charge for board was made in the logging camps when the men were inactive on account of sickness or bad weather. But in that year, the workers were forced to pay for board while inactive. This, of course, effectively reduced wages. 9. The lumber industry was thus an ideal field for the IWW. Conditions were bad. The lumberjack was hardly considered civilized and was generally called a timber beast, a brute interested only in booze, bawds and battle. The feeble attempts of the A.F.L. had amply demonstrated that the lumber industry was not suited for craft organization, since there was a preponderance of unskilled, or at best, semi-skilled workers, and even had it been possible to allot each man to a particular craft, the result would have been an impossible litter of separate unions. As the IWW pointed out, one set of men fell the trees. Others cut them up into logs. One man acts as hook tender, others set the chokers. A fireman keeps up steam in the boiler, and the engineer runs the donkey. Some load the logs on cars and the railroad crew haul them out of the woods. Some act as riggers, and some as cooks and flunkies. 10. The industry, in short, included many different trades, each of which, if organized separately, would have had only one or possibly 2 or 3 members in each camp. In 1890, the International Shingle Weavers Union of America entered the field, and affiliated itself with the A.F.L. But the 1893 strike against wage cuts was lost, and the union was destroyed in the developing depression. Years later, the union was reorganized, and in January 1903, the International Shingle Weavers Union of America, A.F.L., took its place again in the lumber industry with 300 members. But it represented only the skilled workers in the industry, an ever-decreasing percentage of the total working force. Attempts at organizing the loggers and sawmill workers were made by the Western and American labor union during this period, and largely as a response to this challenge, the A.F.L. in 1905 authorized the formation of the International Brotherhood of Woodsmen and Sawmill Workers. But the A.F.L. was not really interested in organizing the workers, and the union, emphasizing that it wished to avoid strikes, stressed benefit features and cooperative societies. This coffin society, as it was called by the timber workers, soon lost the woodsmen and sawmill workers it had recruited during the spring of 1905. By 1906, all the locals on the West Coast had fallen apart. Vernon H. Jensen, Lumber and Labor, New York, 1945, pp. IJ-19, Industrial Union Bulletin, June 15, 1907. L.W.W. In Lumber, 1905-12. The IWW made its appearance in the lumber industry during 1905 and 1906, but the conflicts within the organization prevented it from devoting the required attention to this field. It was not until the militant sawmill strike in Portland in March 1907 that the organization really came to the attention of the lumber workers. The unity of mill workers and lumberjacks in this strike, in the face of A.F.L. scabbing, was so unprecedented a development that it gave heart to thousands of discouraged forest workers. WW lumber locals were established in Seattle and in the California redwoods. Despite these gains, the depression of 190J, less than greater than 8 kept WW activity down to a minimum. But by late 1909 the Wobblies were fully active again in the Northwest, and, following the Spokane free speech fight, the IWW undertook a new agitation among the lumber workers, confident that this great victory would produce immediate results. In February 19 RN, the IWW announced that delegates were being placed in logging camps, lumber and shingle mills, as fast as possible, and urged all lumberjacks and mill workers to get in touch with them. 11. During the next year, WW publications carried reports of the work of these job delegates. Not all of these reports were encouraging. Too many of the delegates simply told off the boss about conditions in the camp, quit work, and went on to another camp. There they found conditions just as bad, again told off that boss, and went on to another job. Instead of organizing the workers, they sent reports to the LNDT-4 Streel worker notifying the lumberjacks, bum job, stay away. Fred Hesselwood, a veteran organizer, advised wobbly lumberjacks that instead of quitting, when conditions are so intolerable, call a meeting in one end of the bunkhouse of all IWW men and as many more as arc in favor of effecting the particular cure you wish. March to the boss. And let Mr. Boss know that if such and such is not granted right away that you will all go down the line. That will be found effective, where one quitting at a time will amount to nothing. 12. A number of wobblies took this advice to heart. I was fired from 6 camps in 1 week, a logger wrote from Oaks Point, Wash, because I talked WW to the men. But I am going to give them all the hell I can. 18 reports of organizational progress among California lumber workers began to occupy space in the LWW press. In July 1911, a year after John Pankner began his organizational work in Eureka, the Secretary of Lumber Workers Industrial Union No. 431 was able to report that more than 500 loggers attended the IWW meeting. 35 new members were signed up, and the Secretary attributed the success of the drive to the excellent camp delegate system and the agitation for an 8-hour day which was being led by the Wobblies. He confidently predicted that the entire redwood industry would be organized by the end of 1911.14. Nevertheless, the year ended with these optimistic predictions far from realized. Lumber Workers Industrial Union No. 432 of Seattle, the largest local made up only of lumber workers, had grown from 68 members to over 6,000 in 9 months. But even though its system of organizing directly in the camps was the envy of the other lumber locals, it was far from satisfied either with its own progress or that of the IWW as a whole in the lumber industry. In October 1911, it recommended that a convention of all lumber locals be held to adopt more efficient methods of organizing the industry. The industrial worker endorsed this recommendation in a Loggers and Lumber Workers Special, Issue .15. On February 12, 1912, the WW locals in the lumber industry met in Seattle and formed the National Industrial Union of Forest and Lumber Workers. It was to include all rangers, foresters, game wardens, wood choppers, lumber workers, saw and shingle mill workers, and collectors of sap, herbs, leaves, cork, and bark. Plans to gather and hold these workers in a powerful forestry and lumbering union were outlined. They called for placing 2 live delegates in each camp and sawmill who would visit every worker personally and try to get him to join the union. Regular publication of conditions in the camp and mill. Monthly discuss science in the camps on such subjects as economics, tactics, methods, and history of the labor movement. Entertainments, such as smokers, boxing matches, picnics and dances, where loggers and mill workers could meet socially. Regular visits by the organized loggers to the towns where they should join the organized sawmill workers in displaying their union buttons, and a campaign to line up all town workers, cooks, waiters, dishwashers, chambermaids, porters, bartenders, butchers, bakers, clerks, laundry girls, laborers, teamsters, etc. behind the lumberjacks and mill workers so that when they went on strike they would have the town workers behind them. The combined power of the lumber workers and the town workers would make it impossible for the gigantic lumber trust to break the strike by physical violence of mob or military. Come on you loggers and mill workers, the new union appealed, get wise to your conditions and make them better by getting into one big union. 16. Grays Harbor and Coos Bay. 1 month after the industrial union was organized, the first strike of lumber workers erupted in Grays Harbor in western Washington, beginning in the mills of Hoquiam and spreading to Raymond and Aberdeen. With Aberdeen as its capital, Grays Harbor was the chief center of the huge lumber barony of Frederick Weyerhaeuser, the German immigrant. American forests. Although he had a reputation of being a man of social vision, who had built a huge fortune by hard work, Weyerhaeuser had acquired a large part of his huge timber holdings in the states of Oregon and Washington by devious methods of fraud, graft, coercion, and outright theft, most of it at the expense of the American P. Koppel. 17 Weyerhaeuser's labor policy was summarized by one of his lieutenants in the Grays Harbor Mills. Don't have too great a percentage of one nationality. For their own sake and your own, mix them up and obliterate clannishness and selfish social prejudices. Keep out the disturbers. They're dear at any price. Once into Grays Harbor, the emigrant bureaus sent Greeks, Slavs, Croatians, and the mill owners, agents of Weyerhaeuser, the absentee feudal baron, were confident that this policy of keeping a wide assortment of different nationalities would keep unionism out of the mills. Their confidence was bolstered by the knowledge that the local AFL unions showed no interest in organizing these foreign-born, unskilled workers. But in the summer of 19U, the Wobblies entered the area, carrying their offices in their pockets, speaking on the street corners in the evenings, distributing leaflets to the mill workers and selling song sheets. The great free speech fight soon followed in Aberdeen, and though that ended in a victory for the IWW in mid-January 1912, it was but the prologue to the big battle for improvement in the conditions of the lumber workers. On March 14, 1912, the unorganized Greek, Austrian, and Finnish mill workers, in Hoquiam, unable any longer to tolerate working conditions, walked out spontaneously. The IWW quickly stepped into the situation. The majority of the workers in the walkout were Greeks, and, for some time, the newspapers in Washington and Oregon referred to it as the LWW Greek Strike. 19.
On the second day of the strike, a list of demands was agreed upon at a mass meeting of the strikers in Hoquiam, chaired by Dr.
Herman F. Titus, who had come from Seattle to aid in the struggle. Workers had been paid $2 and $2.50 for a 10-hour day. Now they demanded an eighth-hour workday and raises of 25 and 50 cents per day, bringing the minimum wage scale up to $2.25. Although the list of demands was formally presented on the following day to the mill owners, there were no prolonged negotiations and, as the strike spread, the men generally quit without even asking for an increase in wages. This, the Portland Oregonian reported, is in furtherance of the ideas advanced by the IWW agitators that a demand for higher wages is not necessary when a man draws only $2 a day. They say that such wages imply a demand for an increase, and that a request for an advance is superfluous. 120. Plants all over the Grays Harbor area were called out by roving IWW pickets, while other pickets blockaded mills and railroads. Day after day, the mills were pulled out of activity in 3s and 4s, and by March 28, the walkout, which had started in Hoquiam, had resulted in a general tie-up of the Grays Harbor lumber industry. Most of the major mills in the area were dosed up tight, and though there had been many arrests and some fighting, the IWW refrained from using violence in dosing the plants. The strike at this point was successful, and the workers' ranks were strong. At first, the mill owners had done little to fight the strike. Since the market at the time was poor, they saw no reason to hurry reopening of the plants. But as the strike spread and the AF of L skilled mechanics in the mills walked out in sympathy, they became alarmed. The alarm increased when AF of L longshoremen in Aberdeen and Hoquiam also went out on strike in sympathy with the mill workers, leaving boats loaded with lumber idle. In Snohomish County, loggers struck in sympathy with the millmen of Grays Harbor. 21. On March 29, greater than a new phase of the strike started as the employers set out to smash the walkout by violence. The citizen police, which had been a notorious feature of the Aberdeen free speech fight, was revived. Years later, a lumberman and shipbuilder of Grays Harbor told an interviewer, guided by a simple physical reaction, "We organized a vigilante committee, a citizens' committee I think we called it, to put down the strike by intimidation and force. I was elected leader of the committee. We got hundreds of heavy dubs of the weight and size of pick handles, armed our vigilantes with them, and that night raided all the LWW headquarters, rounded up as many of the men as we could find and escorted them out of town. Then began a program of systematic deportations." 22. The report in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer of March 31, 1912, fills in the details. Today, March 30th, was moving day in Raymond, and if the census were taken tomorrow, Raymond's population would be shy some 155 names, unless all signs fail. Hereafter Raymond is to be strictly an American city. The exodus began this afternoon when 50 Finlanders boarded a boat and steamed down the bay. They were followed shortly afterward by twice that number of Greeks, who elected to travel by rail and went in another direction. The reason for the hurried departure is no mystery. Beginning at 10:30 this morning, 200 special police began a weeding out process, and the strikers who refused to go to work were loaded into a boxcar and later in the afternoon were loaded into a launch and shipped to Nakata. The posse went out to the Greek settlement and announced that all who did not report for work by 1 o'clock this afternoon would be sent out of town. At 1:30 o'clock, special police went to the Greek quarters, and all who had refused to report for work were herded down to the railroad track and held in boxcars until the departure of the afternoon train, when they were loaded into the passenger cars. The number sent out will run up to nearly 150. Efforts will be made to get in American labor from the larger cities. Men have been sent to the larger cities to pick up good American laborers, preferably married men. The following day, the Post-Intelligencer reported, 100 of the Greeks who were shipped out of Raymond Saturday returned to this city on the afternoon train yesterday. They got off the train, turned right around and went right back, with 200 angry citizens prodding them along. The Greek consul at Tacoma, Washington, angered by the treatment accorded his countrymen, came to investigate the situation. He found that there was not a single case of violence sustained against the LWW, even though the authorities tried to prove the strikers guilty of lawlessness. 28. The deportations were followed by a month of violent acts against the IWW, carried out over the protest of decent citizens, including Mayor Ferguson of Hoquiam, by shotgun brigades of businessmen in each of the struck towns. Halls were raided by the special police, individual members jailed, 100 daily in Aberdeen alone, beaten, and deported in boxcars. A group of masked men seized Joseph Biscay and W.A. Thorne, two of the leaders of the strike, in their hot D room in Aberdeen, led them struggling through the downtown streets to a waiting automobile, and outside the city limits, the vigilantes beat them and sent them on their way. Although the sheriff and the city attorney admitted that the action was a violation of the law, they made no effort to prosecute the case. The regular police not only did not interfere but encouraged the vigilantes. Aberdeen's chief of police told Arthur Jensen, a Scripps reporter, that he would bust the strike or bust their goddamned heads. 1,500 men, women and children, wearing badges reading, "Against the Shotgun Brigade," paraded in Aberdeen for the IWW on March 31st. The authorities greeted the paraders by having fire hoses turned upon them. Several of the women paraders were arrested, and one, Monty Niemi, a mother of 7 children, had her infant of 2 months brought to her in jail so that she could feed the child. 211. The arrests, deportations, and the mass violence of the employers took their toll. By April 9, most of the mills of Grays Harbor were running close to capacity, with a strictly American crew. Fighting still continued, however, with the wives of the strikers taking an active part. On April 10, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer reported from Aberdeen, at noon 25 women pickets at Slade's Mill laid hold of men returning to work in the mill and refused to desist when warned. The mill hose was turned on the women and they were drenched. Several of the women had babies in carriages with them. The women later marched in a body to the city hall and demanded protection for themselves. Tonight the women
pickets at Slade's Mill were again in the front rank, the men standing behind them. 2 days later, it reported, women sympathizers of the strikers went to the woods today and cut 5 bundred switches, which they declared they would lay on the backs of men who go to work in the sawmills tomorrow.
Every morning women have appeared at the mills with baby buggies, and every morning the mill hose has been turned on them. The IWW did not officially call off the strike until May 7. Although the strikers' wage demands were partially met, hours of work remained the same.
But the IWW had been thrown out of Grays Harbor, and foreign workers had either been deported or forced into what was almost slavery, being faced with an ultimatum to work or be deported. One final aspect of the strike is of interest.
Several AFL officials in the Pacific Northwest were openly critical of the actions of the members in the mills and the longshoremen who had supported the strike. The Labor World of Spokane, official journal of the AFL Central Labor Council, angrily called such critics pretty scabby trash. Whatever may be said of some of the foolish things that the IWW is frequently guilty of, they at least seem to have the courage in this case to put up a good fight for decent working conditions in the Grays Harbor district that some other working men seem too cowardly to tackle. 27. The IWW was more successful in the spring of 1912 on Puget Sound in Washington. Here about 5,000 loggers and sawmill workers, under the leadership of the National Industrial Union of Forest and Lumber Workers, went on strike for better conditions. They demanded that springs, mattresses, and good, clean blankets be furnished by the lumber companies. The companies yielded after 2 weeks, and in the camps of Puget Sound the men slept under clean blankets on clean mattresses with springs, and instead of the usual IO to 40 men in each room there were now only 2 men to a room. The J.W.W. boasted that, the first thing that strikes a lumber worker in looking at the employment boards in Seattle is the fact that there are many signs stating, "No blankets
needed." 28. The idea of a lumber worker who was not a blanket stiff was so revolutionary that the IWW made a special point of its victory on
Puget Sound, and assured workers in every lumber camp that they had only to join the NL.U of F and LW and the blanket carrying can be done away with in your camp. 29. But the employers of Grays Harbor had developed a method of operation against the organizing efforts of the IWW in the lumber industry, which was to make additional victories difficult to achieve. In the Coos Bay region of Oregon, which included Mansfield, North Bend, Bandon,
Coquille, and Myrtle Point, the loggers organized in local number 435 of the Forest and Lumber Workers walked off the job in May 1913, in protest against a lockout of IWW members in the lumber camps. At the
same time, they formulated demands for higher wages, shorter hours and better living conditions in the camps. The battle continued through
November, marked by beatings, arrests, raids on the LWW halls, and deportations of strikers by armed vigilantes, businessmen of the communities, and agents of the lumber barons. W. J. Edgeworth and Wesley Everest, IWW organizers, and Dr. B. K. Leach, a physician friendly to the strikers, were rounded up by 6 vigilantes, dragged through the streets of Mansfield, beaten, periodically forced to kneel and kiss an American flag, and deported from town in a small boat. The vigilantes, all of them prominent patriots, wrote a reporter, marched to the building where the IWW had been holding its organization meetings, and notified the proprietor that he had better refuse the LWW the right to gather there, or he and all members of the union would be treated to a similar experience as that visited upon Edgeworth, Everest and Leach. 30.
So shocking was the vigilante terrorism in the Coos Bay area that Oswald West, governor of Oregon, was forced to order the Attorney General to look into the matter. The report, though extremely critical of the IWW and especially of appeals for sabotage, conceded that the strike was a legitimate effort of the loggers to remedy intolerable conditions in the camps, and that the mob violence against the IWW was due solely to the fact that the organization was the only one that dared to do something about improving these conditions.
After receiving the report, Governor West commented, "The alleged practices of the IWW and their damnable methods of crippling and destroying the property of an employer are no worse than mob violence, for, while the former may result in the driving of spikes into saw logs and the destruction of a mill, the latter is equivalent to driving spikes into the law of the land and the destruction of established government." The governor failed to draw a distinction between the alleged practices of the IWW and the proven mob violence against the strikers. This statement condemning mob violence, published late in November 1913, came too late to be of much assistance to the strikers. The vigilantes had, by this time, driven many of the strikers out of the area, and forced the others back to their jobs. 31.
Weakness of LWW in lumber. About the same time that the violent battle was raging in the Coos Bay area, the NU of F and LW began a campaign for a general strike of lumber workers in the Northwest and California. The demands were for an 8-hour day, a minimum wage of $3 per day in the lumber camps and a minimum wage of $2.50 in all mills and lumberyards, time and a half for overtime and Sunday work, clean, sanitary bunkhouses without top bunks and with springs, mattresses, and bedding furnished free of charge, clean towels and soap furnished free of charge in all camps. All camps to be supplied with bathrooms and dry rooms, safety precautions in the mills, and abolition of paid employment offices. 32 The general strike began on June 5, 1913, and it soon became apparent that either it was inadequately prepared or else the lumber workers did not believe it was possible to achieve these demands at this stage. In any event, there was little evidence of any strike activity, and, on July 3, the IWW called off the general strike. However, even opponents of the IWW conceded that camp conditions were much bettered, even though they failed to get the 8-hour day. 33. By the summer of 1913 it was apparent that the National Union of Forest and Lumber Workers was getting nowhere in its efforts to organize the industry. It reported only 640 members to the IWW National Convention in September 1913, with only local units in the Northwest remaining to carry on activity. 34 During 1914 the Union remained in this condition, and the year was devoted primarily to stock-taking. Most of the discussion revolved around methods of organization. Up to this period the main method of organization had been to set up IWW headquarters in the towns where the lumberjacks congregated between jobs. The theory had been that the men, listening to wobbly street corner speakers in the towns, would join the IWW. Sleeping in the wobbly halls and going to meetings where they were plied with literature, they would then carry the message of the one big union back with them to their jobs in the woods, making the IWW a dominant force there. But the theory did not work out in practice. For one thing, wobbly leaders soon found that many of the newly recruited members forgot all about the one big union when they left the town for the woods. Moreover, during strikes of the mill workers, as in the case of the strike in the Grays Harbor area in the spring of 1912, the town locals could not sufficiently influence the lumberjacks to join the strike. Unable to function in the camps, the town locals simply could not include the loggers in their plans for the strike, and, even when they were able to do so, they found the loggers cool to appeals from men who were not themselves lumberjacks. ND who carried on the management of the strike from towns remote from the camps. 35. It was clear, then, that the whole idea of recruiting workers and obtaining job control miles away from the job violated all principles of effective organization. As J.S. Biscay, a veteran IWW organizer among the lumber workers, put it, in general, the lumberjack sees no economic advantage in joining a lumber local in Seattle while he must toil along the Columbia River all winter. He sees little economic control from the distant city, and his toilsome nightmare of a job is right under his nose along with his misery. In his eyes the town local is simply a very loosely decentralized fraternity of lumberjacks with a hall to sit in while in town for a week or so. Being absent, he has practically nothing to say about the
Business of the local which should be his. 36. The answer to this problem, which emerged after several experiments, was the job delegate system.
This plan of organization provided for having a delegate in each camp, who was a logger himself, to sign up members, and with a permanent branch in or near the camp and a secretary in charge. The men, once introduced to the IWW on the job and often seeing the job delegate take up their grievances with the boss on the spot, tended either to join the Wobblies in the camps or to migrate to the friendly IWW hall when they arrived in town. And when they returned to the camps, they no longer lost contact with the organization, for the permanent branch was there and the delegate and the secretary were present to act as spokesmen on any grievances the men had, and, in case of a worker meeting with an accident, to see that he received immediate and proper medical attention. 37. Conditions of construction workers. The job delegate system of organization was first introduced by the IWW among the railroad construction workers. This is not surprising. For the most part, this type of work, like lumber, was temporary, and it employed a large number of migratory workers who also lived in camps. The wages were low, the work hard, and the living conditions no better than those in the lumber camps. All along the Canadian Northern Railway the places provided for the workers to live in were termed bunkhouses only by courtesy. The men lived in shacks without floors or windows, the only ventilation being provided by the doors. Tier after tier of bunks were crowded into these unventilated shacks, and scarcely sufficient space was left between them to permit a man to crawl into bed. An investigating committee reported in 1912, owing to overcrowding and lack of ventilation, the air became so foul nights that it was not an uncommon occurrence for the men to arise in the morning too sick to work. 38. In some of the camps, the construction workers were forced to rustle through the woods to get grass and leaves to lay on. And in all, the food was poor. Grub unfit for a dog, everything rotten, and the embalmed meat has been doctored to such an extent that even the flies won't go near it, was a typical description. 39. Other conditions in these camps which aroused the resentment of the job delegate system was preceded by the camp delegate system.
The delegate, instead of operating in town, would go out to the camp, collect dues, distribute literature there, and generally bring the organization to the men. He would keep in touch with the local in town by correspondence, informing the secretary at least once a month regarding conditions in the camp. But even this system proved to be faulty, for the local was still unable to function effectively on a job while it was located at a distance from the camp. Industrial WORKCR, Feb. 11, 1912. Workers was the fact that water was available only from a creek some distance from the camp, that only 7 or 8 dishpans were supplied for washing purposes for all the men, and the long hours of work, most often 12 hours a day. A complaint in all construction camps was the indifference of the contractors to the safety of the workers. The work by its nature was extremely dangerous even under the most careful administration, but the workers charged that contractors, in their greed, failed to provide enough timber to prevent rock falls. It was common, wrote a reporter who made a study of the conditions in the camps, to hear a crippled worker, when speaking of the accident that had robbed him of an arm or leg, remark bitterly that men were cheaper to the contractor than timber, and that it cost him less if the worker lost a limb than it would be to provide timber that would have prevented the fall of rock that had caused the accident. 46. The Canadian Northern Strike. The industrial worker of August 17, 19N, carried a call from a group of construction workers building the Canadian Northern Railway in British Columbia for an WW organizer to help them form a union. In response, J.S. Biscay was sent from Vancouver and, by the end of August, recruiting drives in Lytton, Spence's Bridge, Ashcraft, and other camps as far as Kamloops had produced local No. 327 with GU members. In September, along 100 miles of construction, the men began strikes for higher pay. The contractors appealed to the authorities to send in troops to force the men to work, but the request was rejected. On September 22, while visiting a camp near Savins, Biscay was kidnapped, then arrested on the charge of having a gun in his possession and of being a dangerous character and a menace to public safety. He was locked up in the provincial jail at Kamloops. Announcing that it would not stand by idly, and see our fellow worker railroaded to jail for the crime of organizing the working class, local number 327 threatened a mass exodus of workers from the construction camps all along the Canadian Northern if Biscay was not released. The threat produced results. After a speedy trial, Biscay was found not guilty of being a dangerous character. By November 19, when he returned to organizing work, local No. 327 had grown to a membership of 3,000.41. It was at this time that local No. 327 introduced the job delegate system. Lytton was the central point of the construction work on the Canadian Northern, the two others being Yale and Savona. These three were the principal stopping-off points for workers on the way to many camps.
The local set up branches at Yale and Savona, each with secretaries. 4 to 6 organizers were kept on the road mainly to collect dues, instruct the membership in the camps, and take up their grievances. So powerful did the local become through the job delegate system that in December 1911 it won a raise of 50 cents a day without a strike. Camp conditions were improved. By February 1912, the membership had swelled to nearly 8. As the workers moved from one point on the line to another, they only changed branches. The local remained a unit. 42. Despite some improvements, conditions still remained extremely poor, particularly the unsanitary nature of the construction camps along the Canadian Northern. A petition with 5,000 signers was forwarded to the Health Department in Vancouver in February 1912, requesting an investigation of violations of the Provincial Health Act governing camps. A government inspector investigated, spelled out numerous violations of the law, and called for immediate action to prevent an outburst from the workers. But the government failed to act. 48. In March the unrest became marked in all the camps. On March 27, the men in Nelson Benson's camp number 4, unable to stand the unbearable conditions any longer, walked out in a body. On their way to Lytton they were joined by the crews of the camps they passed. Upon reaching Lytton, a meeting was held in the headquarters of Local No. 327, a strike call issued, and delegates appointed to carry it along the entire line. Camp after camp walked out, and in 3 days close to 400 miles of the line were tied up completely. Out of 8 construction workers, of all nationalities, fewer than 50 remained at work. The strikers demanded 1. That the Provincial Health Act be strictly enforced in all camps. 2. A 9-hour day with a minimum wage of $3, for tunnelmen 8 hours at $3. 3. Meals to be charged at the rate of 25 cents each. 4. Cooks, teamsters, and muckers to be paid $3, and 5. Blacksmiths to be paid $4 for 9 hours of outdoor work and 8 hours of inside work. 44. The strike extended over 400 miles of territory, but actually the WW established a 1,000-mile picket line, as Wobblies picketed the CM employment offices in Vancouver, Seattle, Tacoma, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. The pickets kept many from departing for the camps, and IWW missionaries who joined those who shipped out induced others to quit en route. 411. The strike was fought ferociously by the railroad officials and contractors. Constables were rushed in the hope that incidents of violence could be used to arrest and imprison the strikers. But the strike committee appointed its own constables to maintain order. Committees were elected to supervise every aspect of the strike. Commissaries, sleeping quarters, and details of housing and feeding over 7,000 men were attended to. A system of communication between the various strike camps was established, with scouts moving back and forth to report any attempt to import scabs. Strict discipline was maintained. Strikers were forbidden to take more than 2 drinks a day and no bottled liquor was permitted. A striker's constable stood guard at each saloon to enforce the rule, and a court set up by the strikers punished any infraction of the strike committee's rule on drinking with such sentences as: go out and cut 10 big armfuls of firewood, carry 10 coal oil cans full of water for the camp cooks, help the cooks for 1 day. When it was discovered that even then some strikers were sneaking out of the saloon's back way, a boycott was ordered against the establishments and all strikers were ordered to stay away. The saloons now were picketed as well as the camps. Before the strike, wrote a visitor to the scene, the saloons had been taking $300 a day, $1,200 on holidays. After the strike began, the saloons complained to me that they could not sell a single drink. 46. To occupy the spare time of the strikers when they were not picketing camps, the strike committee established lectures on working class matters, not only from the viewpoint of the immediate strike, but also as to the future. 047. All visitors, including reporters for the Canadian press, marveled at the order maintained and the sense of solidarity of the strikers in the camps. The camp at Yale was even called a miniature socialist republic. While the industrial worker did not go this far, it insisted that the strikers at Yale are laying a broad and deep foundation for a system of society managed industrially by those who do the world's work. The strike as a whole was proof that the workers are becoming capable of managing their own affairs and thereby are demonstrating their fitness to manage industry when power is gained to take and hold the industries. A Canadian labor paper saw in the strike a warning to foreign capitalists to stay away from Canada. As an example of working class solidarity, it would be hard to find another to compare with the present strike of unskilled workers. To see Canadians, Americans, Italians, Austrians, Swedes, Norwegians, French, and old countrymen one huge, melting pot, into which creed, color, flag, religion, language and all other differences have been flung as a hint for King Capital to look out for some other country more healthy for him to exploit labor than this. 48. Unable to make arrests on the charge of creating violence, the authorities arrested the strikers for unlawful assemblage and vagrancy. Hundreds of strikers filled the jails of British Columbia, but with the cost of maintaining them in jail mounting, the arrests said. Instead, strikers were forcibly deported. The men were ordered at the point of guns to return to work or leave the region of the construction camps. Martial law was in operation even without a formal declaration. Still, the strike remained unbroken. Picket lines were still maintained at every point where the contractors attempted to obtain scabs, including all the large cities of the Pacific Northwest. The tie-up is as complete now as it was after the walkout, a Canadian paper reported late in June, and the strikers are standing firm. 49. In August, the strike merged with a similar walkout on the construction of the Grand Trunk Pacific in British Columbia and Alberta. Here 3,000 men quit work demanding $3.25 to $3.50 for a 9-hour day. Time and a half for all overtime and Sundays. Board not to exceed $1 a day. Better food and strict enforcement of the sanitary laws governing camps. Hospital fees to be turned over to the IWW, which would equip and maintain all hospitals, and the right of organizers and delegates to have access to the camps at all times. 50. Both strikes were supported by the labor movement of Western Canada, including most of the AFL unions. Indeed, without their aid it would have been difficult for the IWW to have carried on the struggle on the Canadian Northern. After the third month, the British Columbia Federationists served as the regular weekly strike bulletin. The strike, the Federationist noted, has resulted in drawing the various labor organizations closer together and creating a spirit of harmony and solidarity among them. The spirit of the rank and file of the AFL towards the strike, declared E.N. Gilbert, secretary of the strike committee, has been commendable and shows that not only is the rank and file with us but also the officials of the AFL. I am sure the strikers appreciate it. 51 but C0. Young, the AFL organizer in the area, did not appreciate it. Young, who, it will be recalled, had played such a despicable role in the free speech fights, was furious. He complained to Frank Morrison that the labor leaders in Vancouver have lent the IWW aid and advised the unions to assist these outlaws. The unions, strange to say, have neglected their own suffering members on strike to aid a band of lawless brigands. 52. The strike on the Canadian Northern lasted until the fall of 1912, when it was ended with some minor improvements for the workers. The strike on the Grand Trunk Pacific was called off in January 1913 when the Dominion government promised to enforce the sanitary laws. 113, but the militancy of the construction workers, their labor solidarity, their method of organization, exemplified in the job delegate system, and their strike strategy, were to furnish an important chapter in the history of the Canadian labor movement. 1. W. Accomplishments. Since almost every migratory worker at one time or another spent part of his time on some railroad construction job, it was to be expected that the job delegate system should be eventually carried over into lumbering with some modifications. But it was not introduced by the IWW on an extensive scale until 1915, when it was used to launch a new national organizing drive among the workers in the grain fields. From there, it was carried over into the woods, with results that were to astound the entire nation. The seeds that produced the great harvest after 1916 in the organization of the lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest had been planted years before. For over a decade the Wobblies had moved among the homeless men of the logging camps, preaching their message of one big union, in bunkhouses and in towns where the loggers gathered. Time and again they were driven out of the towns by vigilantes, and the strikes they led were broken by terrorist tactics. But they had introduced the loggers to the WW, and many of them joined the organization at one time or another during these years. Poor plans and tactics of organization failed to keep them as loyal members who paid their dues regularly, and by 1915 the National Union of Forest and Lumber Workers, which recruited the loggers, consisted of only a few scattered locals. Then, as we shall see, in 1917 the years of earnest proselytizing among the exploited lumber workers returned dividends. The propaganda and agitation among the lumber workers over the years had created a considerable body of Wobbly sympathizers. Solidarity was not boasting without cause when it observed on April 13, 1912. If there is one section of the country where WW propaganda has been practically universal and has left an indelible impression on the brains of the slaves, that section is among the entire Pacific coast from Vancouver to San Diego. For 7 years the WW agitators have moved up and down, in and out, through mining and lumber camps, along waterfronts, on street corners, carrying and leaving the message and literature of the one big union. This was the foundation which the IWW used to build a powerful union based on a new method of organization in the lumber industry of the Pacific Northwest, the influence of which spread rapidly to California and helped to create a strong organization in the lumber industry of that state. Wobbly activity among the lumber workers in the Northwest in California finally produced results. The National Union of Forest and Lumber Workers went out of existence in 1915, and between that time and 1917 most wobblies in the lumber industry belonged to the Agricultural Workers Organization. Chapter 10. The Southern Lumber Drive. Although the story of the IWW in the lumber industry is mainly associated with the loggers and mill workers of the Pacific Northwest in California, one of its most interesting and inspiring chapters relates to the lumber industry of the South. There were important differences between the labor force in southern and western lumbering. One was that the former was not composed of migratory workers but rather of men who lived the year round in the area. One another was that the labor force in the southern lumber industry was made up of both white and Negro workers. Indeed, in 1910, over half of the labor force of 262,000 workers was composed of Negroes. In the main, the Negroes were unskilled workers in the lowest paid jobs, and had little opportunity to rise to higher paid jobs. They did most of the heavy manual work in the sawmills, on railroads, in the turpentine camps, at skidways, and in the swamps. In 1910, of 7,958 Negroes in the sawmills and planing mills of Texas, 7,216 were laborers. There was not a single Negro sawyer. Street. Lewis, lumberman, justified this situation on the ground that there is a limit to the amount of wages that can be paid with safety to colored laborers around sawmills and wood camps. Too much pay breeds discontent and idleness among them. 2. To the Negro lumber worker, notes a student of the Mississippi lumber industry, emancipation from slavery had not brought the fruits of freedom. He simply had exchanged his lot for a different system of economic bondage. 1. Conditions in southern lumber industry. The magnificent forests of Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, East Texas, and South Georgia were literally stolen by the lumber companies from the public domain. Many of the forests were supposed to be school lands set aside for the benefit of education by the U.S. government. Instead, they were handed over to the lumber kings for prices ranging from 12.5 cents to 75 cents an acre, and this, too, at a time when public schools in these states were closing for lack of funds. Having grabbed these fours, Nay Company owned 87,000 acres in a single tract in western Louisiana and eastern Texas. The companies proceeded to operate them as feudal domains, filling the towns with gunmen whom the authorities had commissioned as deputy sheriffs, and jailing anyone who questioned their rule. The jails also provided the companies with a cheap supply of labor. Men were seized on the railroads for beating their way, and sentenced to go days in jail. Then these unfortunate workers were forced to toil for the period of their sentence in the turpentine camps. Negro and white laborers were frequently arrested, fined, and imprisoned for no offense at all, or simply for being out of a job, and forced to work out their sentence in the lumber camps. Often an employer would arrange to pay the fine on condition that the debt was worked out. 4. In 1904 the Supreme Court upheld laws enacted at the close of the century eliminating peonage, but in the isolated camps in the southern woods these laws and the Supreme Court decision cut little ice. To be sure, individuals found guilty of establishing peonage could be prosecuted and convicted, but few workers in southern lumbering, particularly Negro workers, dared to protest to the authorities, knowing that the company-dominated local courts would never convict the guilty parties. Furthermore, although federal laws outlawed peonage, state laws permitted ample leeway for upholding peonage and other kinds of involuntary servitude. The timber and lumber workers read a complaint in 1912. In many places are being practically held as peons within barbed wire enclosures, where there is no law except the will of the lumber trusts imported thugs and gunmen. 5. Wages in southern lumbering were from 15 to 25% below the national average for the industry, and the southern workweek was approximately 2 hours longer than that which prevailed in the Northwest. For wages as low as $1.25 a day or average weekly wages of from $7 to $G, men were forced to labor 10 to 12 hours a day. With few exceptions, wages were paid monthly, and usually either entirely, or in large part, in scrip or time checks. Scrip was simply some substitute for legal money, paper chit, cardboard coin, metal tag, etc., which ordinarily bore the name of the issuing company, a valuation in the statement. Good for merchandise only. If spent in the company store, it passed at face value, but it could be converted to cash only at a customary discount of 5 to 30%. Since prices in the company stores ranged from 1/3 to 50% above prices in surrounding communities, the face value of the wages used for merchandise was always considerably reduced. The time check bore the condition that it was to be cashed at some future specified date. If the bearer, for whatever reason, cashed it prior to the specified date, he was generally forced to take a discount of from 5 to 10%. Given the irregular and infrequent paydays, which were then virtually universal in the southern lumbering Indu dollar tri, these forms of payment amounted to extortion, pure and simple. For no man, however prudent, could manage to get from payday to payday without coming in need of legal currency, which is to say, without being forced by the system to take some portion of his earnings at a sizable discount. Some workers, to obtain legal currency, were forced to borrow from the employer at usurious rates of interest. In other words, these workers were actually paying interest on their wages being withheld from them. 8. The great majority of the lumber workers lived and died in communities owned and operated by the mill companies. They were charged outrageous rents for primitive huts heated with open fires. They were forced to pay a compulsory medical insurance fee, usually $1 to $1.50 a month, for doctors in whose selection they had no voice and who knew little or nothing of medicine. They were forced to pay from 75 cents to $1 per month for accident insurance, which was bought by the lumber companies at from 50 to 60 cents per month per man. The casualty companies were paid either on the basis of the average number of workers employed during the month or on a certain percentage of the payroll, while the lumber companies collected 75 cents to $1 a month from every man who went to work, no matter if he worked a month, a week or a day, thereby reaping a huge profit on the insurance. 1. A comprehensive study of conditions in the lumber industry in Louisiana by the State Bureau of Statistics of Labor pointed out, we found every labor law on the statutes being violated. Following a similar study in Texas, the Commission on Industrial Relations found that in such communities, political liberty does not exist and its forms are hollow mockery. Free speech, free assembly, and a free press may be denied as they have been denied time and again, and the employer's agent may be placed in public office to do his bidding. The lumber communities, George Creel wrote in 1915, are as far removed from freedom and democracy as though time had rolled back to the days of Elvanho. 8. Formation of Brotherhood of Timber Workers. The spirit of resentment among Southern lumber workers had produced a series of strikes starting in the late 188s, under the leadership of the Knights of Labor, and continuing sporadically thereafter in local walkouts, with the first notable attempt at organization occurring in 1902. All of them were unsuccessful, and the unions that were formed during these years soon ceased to function. 9. The first widespread revolt of the lumber workers occurred in the autumn of 1907. On top of the poor wages and hours, gouging, in company stores, payment in scrip, excessive insurance and hospital fees, inadequate housing and sanitation, and irregularity of paydays, the lumber companies, taking advantage of the panic of J07, issued orders to cut wages 20% or more, and lengthened the hours of work. Against these orders, all the lumber workers in western Louisiana and eastern Texas rose en masse, and in a spontaneous general strike closed hundreds of mills. Promises of wage increases when economic conditions improved were made to the strikers, and most of them went back to work immediately. Workers from the mills around Ritter, held out for several weeks, but neither they nor the original group that returned gained anything. Not only were the promises not kept, but the oppression grew even worse. 10. Although the workers had failed to organize a union in 1907, the strike and the imminent threat of unionization led to the formation of the Southern Lumber Operators Association. Organized specifically to combat unionism, the association began immediately to introduce methods to prevent organization. Knowing that cash was necessary to finance a union extending over several states, the members of the association intensified their efforts to keep actual money from their workers by refusing to exchange coin for commissary checks at any discount. 11. At the same time, they reinforced their long-standing practice of fostering racial antagonism between Negro and white lumber workers. In secret correspondence, the companies who belonged to the association boasted to each other that race hatred was helping them prevent the formation of a union of lumber workers. One journalist wrote, "The Lumber Trust carefully studies methods for intensifying race antagonism and then sits back to watch it work. Black men or white men, a few lives more or less, are of no consequence to the masters of the swamplands if their snuffing out turns a profit to the companies." 12. So effective were these anti-union methods that by 1910 the Southern Lumber Operators Association practically ceased to function. But it was soon to be revived. In the face of obstacles which seemed impossible to overcome, the Southern lumber workers finally did organize a union, THC Brotherhood of Timber Workers. After a visit to the lumber district of the Pacific Northwest, Arthur L. Emerson returned to his work as a lumberjack in the Texas-Louisiana timber regions, convinced that the only way the lumber workers in Dixieland could lift their wages and conditions to the level of those in the Northwest, which were none too high, was through organization. He enlisted the support of J. Smith, and together they carried the message of unionism to the Southern lumber workers. 13. They met with an immediate response from the workers in the DeRidder area of Louisiana where, it will be remembered, the unsuccessful strike of 1907 had lasted longer than anywhere else. About 90 lumber workers, most of them sympathetic to the IWW, a number were Wobblies, and to the socialist views of Eugene V. Debs, were the first to join the new movement. On December 3, 1910, Emerson and Smith formed the first local at Carson, a lumber camp about 6 miles south of DeRidder. The organization of locals continued throughout the winter of 1910-11, with the Drive supported by the Rebel, a socialist paper published in Hallettsville, Tex, and the Toiler, published in Leesville, by Uncle Pat O'Neill, a veteran of the United Mine Workers. At first it had been decided to organize only the woodsmen, but Emerson noted, "We soon saw that the mills would also have to be organized." 14. Emerson, Smith, and a few others traveled in the guise of book agents, insurance solicitors, evangelists, even card sharps, to avoid company gunmen, going from camp to camp, mill to mill, bringing the message of unionism to the lumber workers. 111 By June 1911, enough locals had been organized to warrant a general convention for the adoption of a formal constitution. It was decided that the future headquarters of the organization should be Alexandria, Louisiana, and the convention was held there. At the convention, the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, or BOTW as it was popularly called, was set up as a national union with Emerson as president, Smith as general secretary, and Pat Guillory as treasurer.
The Constitution provided for a two-level organization: the local units, composed of 25 or more members, and the central body, composed of delegates elected from the locals. Later, as the Brotherhood grew, district councils were informally established in many areas. When the Grand Lodge, as the central organization was called, was not in convention, an executive committee of permanent salaried officers acted in its name. The initiation fee was $1, dues were 50 cents monthly. Membership was open to all persons, regardless of vocation, who may be in sympathy with the labor movement, and who comply with the Constitution, rules, and bylaws of the organization, except only officers and employers in the above industries, timber and lumber, and those whose livelihood was obtained by questionable means. Since Negroes comprised so large a portion of the labor force, the leaders of the Brotherhood knew that no union could be effective in the Yellow Pine region unless it opened its doors to Negroes as well as whites. The basic concept of the organization required that membership be open to Negroes, but the Southern tradition of segregation was retained by providing for colored lodges, which were forbidden to retain their initiation fees and dues but were required to deliver all such funds for safe keeping to the nearest white local. Just as the leaders of the Brotherhood were anxious to avoid being charged with upsetting the Jim Crow pattern of Southern life, they were determined to avoid the charge of being too radical. The Constitution emphasized only limited objectives, went out of its way to recognize the rights of the employer, and rejected the use of violence, in whatever guise it may assume. How far the Union bent backwards to assure the employers that it was not radical is evident in the statement. Our appeal shall be to reason and enlightened humanity. At all times, and in all things, we shall be glad to meet in council with those who employ us, and by acts of reason, justice, and persuasion, try to convince them of the righteousness of our cause. We demand recognition, equal rights, a living wage, a just consideration of abuses, exact and equal justice to those who work with their hands, and who contribute so much to the comforts of mankind, and who get so little in return. 1e. The conservative tone and contents of the Constitution did not appease the employers. Shortly after the Alexandria Convention, the Southern Lumber Operators Association charged the Brotherhood with being an offshoot of the IWW and represented it as a violent, revolutionary organization. 17. The 1911 lockout. The BOTW spread rapidly over Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, recruiting Negro and white lumberjacks, mill workers, tenant and small farmers who worked in the lumber industry for parts of the year, and town craftsmen. From its headquarters in Alexandria, the Union cautioned its members and all workers to refrain at this stage from starting strikes and to avoid disturbances which could be used by the lumber companies as a pretext to smash the organization. Go on with your work and be content with present conditions. 18. The Brotherhood had good reason to be cautious at this stage. The Union's rapid growth had alarmed the employers. In the summer of 1911, individual mill owners began to take action against the organization, requiring all workers to sign a card declaring that they would not join the Union. This caused several strikes and a number of mills shut down, discharged every Brotherhood member, and kept closed down for weeks. 19. But the operators did not rely upon individual action alone to combat the growing Union. The Southern Lumber Operators Association was speedily reactivated and a secret meeting of its membership was called for July 19 at New Orleans. The meeting was attended by some 150 lumbermen from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The president of the association at this time was C.R. Johnson of St. Louis, but the meeting was controlled by John H. Kirby, the largest lumber operator in Texas, who actually directed the activities of the organization. A one-time president of the National Association of Manufacturers, Kirby was determined to smash the Brotherhood of Timber Workers.
The leading speech at the session was delivered by Kirby. He began by announcing that, whenever any efforts are discovered to organize unions, the mills will be dosed down and will remain so until the union is killed. He went on to attack the Brotherhood as an organization which proposed to affiliate with the Industrial Workers of the World of Chicago, a socialistic organization, composed largely of foreign-born citizens and whose teachings reject the Constitution of this republic and deny to any citizen the right to own property. Then the former head of the NAM and a prime leader of the Open Shop Drive, who had frequently condemned the AF launched into a tirade against the IWW on the ground that it seeks to destroy the American Federation of Labor and will put the latter out of business if it can. In contrast to the IWW, the AF was based on the right of property and respect thereof, and it rejected the immoral and criminal philosophy of the Wobblies. Since it was evident that the lumber workers were determined to organize, the question was how to channel this desire into the proper avenue, how, in short, to work out arrangements with the proper organizations of labor. Organization of our workers cannot be prevented. It has already gone too far, and we may as well put up with it. But we are not going to stand for the tactics outlined by the industrial workers of the world.
We will deal with organizations and leaders who will guarantee the owners a fair and just return of profits for legitimate investments, be it in capital or our ability to develop the vast lumber resources of the South.
With this in mind, Kirby had already contacted Ralph M. Easley, Secretary of the National Civic Federation, and he gave me the assurance that the American Federation of Labor is the organization that will serve our purposes, and he referred me to Mr. Samuel Gompers, who would be more than willing to give us advice and suggestions to meet the situation. Gompers agreed to help the lumber companies in their plight, but insisted that the matter not be discussed through correspondence. Kirby then arranged to meet Gompers in Chicago prior to the New Orleans secret session. He told the delegates at New Orleans that Gompers had made the following suggestions: how to meet best the embarrassing situation which we are in. First, the timber workers had to be convinced that the only unions that would be tolerated would be those affiliated with the
AF. Second, all members of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers were to be kept out of the mills, and to achieve this the mills would be shut down. The locked-out workers would return on the employer's terms.
Arrangements were worked out between Kirby and Gompers for the Southern Lumber Operators Association to drive its workers out of the TW, and, after that union was destroyed, to extend recognition to the AF, which would send its representatives into the lumber camps and mills to recruit the skilled white craftsmen. 20 on August 1, 1911, St. Louis Lumberman, organ of the operators, confirmed the willingness of the employers to make a deal with the AF. They have no OB for Kirby's role as a leader of the Open Shop Drive. See Foner, Op. Cit. Volume 3, pp. 34, 36, 37, 57, 6 grams, 258, 333, 349. Objection to unions as such, provided their aims and purposes are reasonable and fair. But they are utterly opposed to labor associations of the character and of the lack of sanity with which they are now confronted, and rather than submit to their demands, wholesale shutdowns of plants will be ordered. Publication of Kirby's speech in the New Orleans Times-Democrat produced a storm of protesting letters to Gompers from AFL members. Typical is a letter from a group of Southern trade unionists. We, the undersigned, members of AFL unionists in Shreveport, Louisiana, have read with feelings of astonishment a report of your meeting with John H. Kirby of the Southern Lumber Operators Association and a notorious open shop employer, in which you were quoted as being ready to join hands with this association, whose reputation for opposition to unionism is known to all union men in the South, for the purpose of assisting the companies in destroying the right of their workers to organize. We cannot possibly believe that the leader of the American Federation of Labor would descend to such depths, and we urge that you immediately issue a statement unequivocally denouncing Mr. Kirby as a liar. 21. Not only did Gompers issue no such statement, he did not even bother to reply to this and similar letters protesting the deal announced KHL. Meanwhile, the companies were carrying out plans for a lockout, announcing to the press that the lumber manufacturers are all determined that this apparently anarchistic organization, BFTW, must not get any further, both for the good of the lumber industry and for the good of the employees themselves. The association ordered the immediate shutdown of 11 mills in the DeRidder area. By this action, 3,000 men were locked out. During the next few months, over 300 other mills in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were closed down, and union men were locked out of, or blacklisted from, every mill within the association's sphere of influence. 22. Early in the lockout, the Brotherhood countered with a series of demands which included 1. A minimum of $2 per day, the workday not to exceed 10 hours in duration. 2. A 2 weeks payday in United States, and not commissary, currency. 3. The right of free trade, the workers not to be forced to buy from company stores. 4. A discontinuance of the practice of discounting wages. 5. Reasonable rents. 6. A revision of insurance, hospital and doctor fees, the men to have the right to elect their doctors, to see the insurance policy and to have representatives on a committee that was to control these funds. 7. A general improvement in the sanitary and living conditions of the lumber towns and camps. 8. The disarming and discharge of all gunmen. 9. The right of free speech, press and assembly. 23. Denouncing these demands as revolutionary and advanced by a movement run wild, 24. The Lumber Kings answered the Union with their brutal campaign of blacklisting. Despite the existence of anti-blacklist laws in the southern states, the association kept a labor clearinghouse through which the operators exchanged information concerning objectionable employees. Association members were required to keep a list of their employees at the central office, supplementing it daily by reports on men discharged and new men employed. A principal question on each report was, have you any reason to believe that he sympathizes with or is a member of the Order of Timber Workers of the World? A letter sent by the Executive Committee of the Association to the Little River
Lumber Company of Manistee, LA, showed the way in which the blacklisting method was used. We will undoubtedly at some future time re-employ large numbers of our former employees whom we have discharged and reported as being affiliated with the Brotherhood of Timber Workers.
This will be only done upon their evidencing in some satisfactory way that they have renounced their allegiance to the Brotherhood of Timber Workers. 7211. There were two ways in which the locked-out workers could furnish satisfactory evidence. One was by individually signing the familiar yellow OOG contract or ironclad oath in which they promised not to belong to the Brotherhood as long as they remained in the company's employ. The other was for groups of workers to sign resolutions condemning the B of TW and pledging their loyalty to the operator. Usually these resolutions were circulated at meetings at which the employees heard anti-union speakers, many supplied by the good citizens. Protective leagues which were organized in eastern Texas and western Louisiana to break up local meetings of the Brotherhood and to intimidate its speakers and organizers. A typical resolution circulated at these meetings read, resolved, that we, the undersigned employees of the Pickering Land and Timber Company of Cravens, Louisiana, are opposed to the organization known as the Brotherhood of Timber Workers and hereby pledge our support to the said company in stamping out the movement of the said organization at this place in order that the plant may continue in operation. 26. The fact that the company had deliberately shut down the plant was, of course, ignored. During the summer and fall of 19N, between 5,000 and 7,000 of the most active members of the Brotherhood, white and Negro, were blacklisted. 27. Those members who were farmers and had some small source of income to fall back on when discharged from the mills could still survive. But for those blacklisted workers who had no other source of income, it was indeed a tragedy. In the southern timber region, outside of farming and lumbering, there were few, if any, sources of employment open to the unemployed worker who had incurred the hostility of the operators. Nevertheless, the vast majority of the lumber workers refused to sign the yellow dog contract. One worker expressed the common attitude, only a low-life lickskillet would do such a thing. I would live on wild plants that grow in the hills before I would sign. 28. Meeting again in secret session in New Orleans on October 31st, the Southern Lumber Operators Association appointed a committee to devise plans for the reopening of the mills. Kirby told the delegates that the war against the Brotherhood was progressing satisfactorily, and that the mills seemed to be in better shape, as far as their labor was concerned. But he conceded that the Union was still alive, though considerably weakened, and that with respect to completely destroying the Brotherhood, the lockout had been far from a total success. The strategy worked out was to reopen the plants, invite Negro members of the Brotherhood to go back to work at higher wages, and recruit Negro scabs from all parts of Louisiana and Texas to keep the mills operating. 29. The first part of this strategy failed completely. No Negro members of the Brotherhood went back to work. To meet the second weapon of the association, the Brotherhood widely circulated an appeal to Negroes throughout Louisiana and Texas which read, if you allow yourselves to be made tools of by these men who are sent out to hunt you up and hold out flattering promises of good wages and good treatment, you are doing the very thing that our organization proposes to prevent and forever put a stop to. The Brotherhood of Timber Workers is the only one that has ever been organized in the South that takes the Negro and protects him and his family along with the white wage worker and his family on an industrial basis. Thousands of your race have taken advantage of the opportunities afforded by our order and have nobly and loyally performed their part in the great struggle of the wage worker for the right to organize and correct the abuses now fastened upon us by the companies. They seem to fully realize that we must all pull together and that each must perform his duty honorably if we expect to win the fight and take our proper place among the organized powers of the world. Are you one of this number of good, loyal Negroes who are willing to stand by their own class, or are you one of those fellows who have no thought of the future welfare of your race as well as yourself and family? If you go in and take the jobs that have been wrongfully taken away from honest, hardworking white and colored men, you will not only assist these millmen to keep up their systems of low wages and abuses unmentionable, but you will also assist them in whipping the many thousands of white men and men of your own color and race. Let us plead with you to get in and help us in this great fight for you and yours. If you cannot do this, in the name of all that is high and holy, do not be misled and made tools of against the best interests of your own class and your own color. 30. The appeal was effective. When the mills reopened in the winter of 1912, the lockout was officially ended by February. It was not with scab labor. While the union did not win its demands, slightly higher wages were gained by many workers, and the 10-hour day was instituted in a number of mills. To be sure, the Brotherhood locals were not recognized, but the union still existed as a force after the infamous war to exterminate it. By May 1912, the Brotherhood had a membership of between 20,000 to 25,000 workers, about half of whom were Negroes. Of these, about 5,000 were paid-up members and probably 15,000 to 20,000 lumber workers and working farmers who were in arrears in dues, but who still claimed membership. In the spring of 1912, E.F. Presley was elected mayor of De Ridder on the Socialist B of TW ticket. 81. B. of TW joins L.W.W. The experience in the battle against the lockout had imbued the Brotherhood with an increased spirit of militancy and class consciousness. In the pamphlet, An Appeal to Timber and Lumber Workers, written by J. Smith, Secretary of the Brotherhood and published in April 1912 by the Union, there was not a hint of the conciliatory position set forth in the organization's constitution. The pamphlet opened on a militant note proclaiming the Union's purpose to be the organization of all wage workers employed in and around the timber and lumber industry into one big union, regardless of creed, color, or nationality. It is, too, our purpose to give sympathy and every assistance in our power to all those who labor in other trade and industry, expecting them to do likewise by us, to the end that all workers may be bound together in one solid, compact army, whose motto shall be, an injury to one is an injury to all, having for its final aim the overthrow of slavery and the emancipation of the race. After repudiating the principle of craft unionism on the ground that it divides the workers on the job, which is just what the bosses want, the pamphlet tackled the Negro question, which it defined in these terms. As far as the Negro question goes, it means simply this: either the whites organize with the Negroes, or the bosses will organize the Negroes against the whites, in which last case it is hardly up to the whites to damn the niggers. Southern workers ought to realize that while there were two colors among the workers in the South, there was actually only one class. It was the main object of this organization to teach that the only hope of the workers is through industrial organization. That while the colors in question are two, the class in question is only one. That the first thing for a real working man to do is to learn by a little study that he belongs to the working class, line up with the Brotherhood of Timber Workers or the industrial workers of the world, and make a start for industrial freedom. In reprinting sections of the pamphlet, the industrial worker noted correctly, for years the South has been in a backward state of development and has to confront a tremendous race prejudice in the form of the Negro question. This pamphlet, when the conditions of the South are taken into consideration, is one that requires a lot of courage to issue, and its widespread distribution will do much to clarify the labor atmosphere of the South. 32. At the September 19 N.W.W. convention, 3 fraternal delegates were present from the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, and during the Union's battle against the lockout, the IWW had rendered it whatever support it could, mainly by publicizing its struggle in the wobbly press. Affiliation with the WW was raised as soon as the lockout was over. The Brotherhood realized that it needed the prestige and support of a stronger organization, and that the IWW was the only effective union in the lumber industry. Moreover, it was the only significant union in the entire labor movement that would welcome a Southern organization which cut across craft and racial lines. When the proposed affiliation was agreed to by the leaders of the B of TW and the WW, the latter organization sent Bill Haywood and Covington Hall to the Brotherhood's second annual convention at Alexandria, May 6 to 9, 1912, to present the case for affiliation to the delegates. Arriving at the convention, Haywood expressed surprise that no Negroes were present. He was informed that the Negro workers were meeting separately in another hall because it was against the law in Louisiana for whites and Negroes to meet together. Haywood brushed this explanation aside, declaring, "You work in the same mills together. Sometimes a black man and a white man chop down the same tree together. You aren't meeting in convention now to discuss the conditions under which you labor. This can't be done intelligently by passing resolutions here and then sending them out to another room for the black man to act upon. Why not be sensible about this and call the Negroes into this convention? It is against the law. This is one time when the law should be broken." Haywood's advice was followed, and the Negroes were called into the session. The mixed gathering adopted the proposal of affiliation with the WW by a vote of 71 ye to 26 yeas and elected Negro and white delegates to the September convention of the WW in Chicago, where the merger was to be formally effected. Haywood also addressed a mass meeting at the Alexandria Opera House under the Brotherhood's sponsorship. Herc, too, there was no segregation, and for the first time in the city's history, Negro and white sat together in all parts of the hall at a public meeting. There was no interference by the management or the police, Haywood reported, and the meeting had a tremendous effect on the workers who discovered that they could mingle in meetings as they mingled at work. Solidarity featured the news from Alexandria under the heading, Rebels of the New South no longer fighting to uphold slavery but to abolish it. The industrial worker carried the news under the heading, Miracle of the New South. In July, the convention's vote to affiliate with the LWW was overwhelmingly confirmed by the Brotherhood's rank and file membership in a general referendum.
At the September convention of the IWW, the merger was consummated and the Brotherhood of Timber Workers became the Southern District of the National Industrial Union of Forest and Lumber Workers. However, the union still continued to be referred to as the Brotherhood. Solidarity's correspondent, covering the convention, wrote from Chicago, "Proof that we have surmounted all barriers of race and color is here in the presence of delegates of many nationalities as well as that of two colored delegates, B. H. Fletcher from Philadelphia and D. R. Gordon of the BTW. Both of the latter are taking active part in the convention and show a clear understanding of the great idea of the one big union of the whole working class. The Grabo affair. The decision to affiliate with the IWW gave new spirit to the Southern lumber workers. On May 1, 1912, just 4 days after the adjournment of the second annual convention, the Brotherhood presented a few of the mills in the DeRidder area with its old list of demands. The demands were summarily rejected, and the union members went out on strike at the mills concerned. The Southern Lumber Operators Association hit back by calling a general lockout throughout the industry. The Lumber Trade, organ of the operators, declared that the lockout would remain in force until the union was destroyed. That the lumber, not even the Socialist Party in Louisiana, allowed Negroes and whites to meet together. Indeed, with the exception of one local, that in Lutcher, which was composed only of Negroes, every SP local in Louisiana was composed exclusively of white members. William C. Saylor, The Rise and Decline of the Socialist Party in the United States, unpublished Ph.D. thesis, Duke University, 1952, pp. 99 Lou. See also Grady McQuinney, Louisiana Socialists in the Early 20th Century. A Study F in Rustic Radicalism, Journal of Southern History, Volume XXX. August. I-954, page 332. Not only were Negroes allowed to join the Brotherhood, but women were also given the right to hold membership and to vote, which was also a very radical move. In the Deep South. Covington Hall. Labor Struggles in the Deep South, unpublished manuscript. Howard Tilton Library, Tulane University, pp. 136-38. Men of the South will not treat with these agitators goes without saying. The only policy which the lumbermen can pursue is that followed in the past, to fight the question to a finish. The mills will never agree to recognize the union. The fact that the union had allowed Negro and white members to meet and consult together in complete violation of the traditions of the South was cited as a sufficient reason for the employers to seek its destruction. 34. The association resumed its former policy of blacklisting all union members. Men applying for employment were forced to sign yellow dog contracts, and all members of the association were required to send reports of men now on your payroll and opposite their names please state whether or not they were former members of the union. The association recruited an army of gunmen and deputies and rushed them into the lumbering districts. Notices were posted around camps reading, "Private property. All unionists, socialists, peddlers and solicitors, keep out under penalty of the law." 311. By the first week in June, the mills began reopening with scab labor. To counter this move, the BFTW leaders called general meetings, usually on weekends, of union members and sympathizers. When the men had gathered, they would then march to various mills employing non-union labor and there deliver speeches and distribute literature outlining the position of the Brotherhood and pointing out the benefits to be derived from organization of all lumber workers into one big union. The operators struck back by breaking up the Brotherhood's meetings. Mobs, led by mill managers and deputy sheriffs, attacked the union gatherings and forced members and sympathizers to leave the area. 38. The climax of terrorism was reached on Sunday, July 7, at Grabo, La. A.L. Emerson and a group of union members and sympathizers were conducting a speaking tour of a number of closely connected camps. Learning that company thugs had gathered at Bon Ami, La. They bypassed this area and headed for the mill, operated by the Galloway
Lumber Company, at Grabo, where a non-union crew had been employed for the past month. It was around 6 o'clock in the evening when the crowd arrived at Grabo. They assembled before the mill, and Emerson began to address the crowd from the bed of a wagon parked near the gallery of the company office. Suddenly 3 shots were fired into the crowd in rapid succession. With the first shots, the Union crowd dispersed and sought cover in the nearby timber. Those of the Union men who were armed exchanged shots with the company guards who were firing from concealment in the company office, from a planing mill and an empty boxcar. When the firing was over, 3 men were dead and more than 40 wounded, one of whom died a few days later. 2 of the dead, Uriah, Roy, Martin and Decatur Hall, were Union members. The third was a company guard. The man who died later was Philip Fazirel, an Italian laborer and member of the Brotherhood. Of the 40-odd wounded, all but 2 or 3 were Union men. Emerson and 64 other Unionists were arrested. Galloway and 4 of the company men were also arrested.
On July 23, the grand jury returned true bills of indictment, 1 bill for each of the 3 men killed outright at Grabo, for murder against Emerson and the 64 Union men.
At the same time, the jury absolved the company men involved. 37. The trial was not scheduled to begin before October. From the end of July to the close of the trial in November, there were over 60 Union men in jail at Lake Charles. This parish prison, never meant to accommodate anything near that number of prisoners, was unbearably overcrowded. In response to protests from the families of the prisoners, the president of the State Board of Health, Drive, Oscar Dowling, examined the Lake Charles prison. He found 60 men in 142 by 30-foot room, and reported that the poor ventilation and defective sewer connections in the room constituted a serious hazard to the health of the prisoners. As a result of the investigation, the number of men held in the room was reduced to 25. The others were removed to the basement of the new courthouse building, which was then under construction. But this change was only a slight improvement. In a statement denouncing barbarous Louisiana, the B. of T.W. Defense Committee called upon all workers to protest. Deluge the governor of Louisiana and the president of the United States with letters and telegrams denouncing this iniquitous prison. Ye men and women of labor, ye lovers of freedom and justice everywhere. 88. The Defense Committee's main function was to win sympathy and financial support for the arrested members of the Brotherhood. In addition to the expense of securing counsel, the committee was faced with the burden of providing support for the prisoners' families for several months. Circulars headed, "Shall Emerson die?" and appealing for funds were distributed throughout the entire country and published in the IWW and Socialist press. One of the most important, and certainly the most widely discussed of the Defense Committee's appeals was addressed to all Negro workers, and especially to the Negro forest and lumber workers of the South, pointing out that the moment the B of T.W. started to revolt against peonage, the lumber kings raised the cries of white supremacy and social equality. Coupled with that other cry, they are organizing Negroes against the whites, the appeal noted.
For a generation, under the influence of these specious cries, they have kept us fighting against each other as to secure the white supremacy of a tramp and you the social equality of a vagrant. Our fathers fell for it, but we, their children, have come to the conclusion that the white supremacy, that means starvation, wages and child slavery for us, and the
social equality, that means the same to you, though they may mean the one high life, and Christian civilization, to the lumber kings and landlords, will have to go. As far as we, the workers of the South, are concerned, the only supremacy and equality they have ever granted us is the supremacy of misery and the equality of rags.
This supremacy and this equality we, the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, mean to stand no longer than we have an organization big and strong enough to enforce our demands, chief among which is a man's life for all the workers in the mills and forests of the South. Because the Negro workers comprise 1/2 or more of the labor employed in the Southern lumber industry, this battle cry of ours has been considered a menace and therefore a crime in the eyes of the Southern oligarchy, for they, as well as we, are fully alive to the fact that we can never raise our standard of living and better our conditions as long as they can keep us split, whether on race, craft or religious or national lines. Emerson and his associates are in prison because they fought for the unity of all workers.
Will you remain silent, turn no hand to help them in this, their hour of great danger? 119. The Defense Committee's appeals for contributions to the defense and relief funds received a general response from labor, including AFL and Railroad Brotherhood locals, and socialist organizations, and from Negroes and socialist farmers in eastern Texas and western Louisiana. Years later, Covington Hall, who headed the defense activities, recalled, Never before or since have I seen the solidarity of labor that was lined up for the defense in the Grabo trial. I would die happy if I could only witness the same solidarity of workers from one end of this continent to the other. 0. The trial opened in Lake Charles on October 7, 1912. The Brotherhood declared October 7 a Union holiday, and urged no member or sympathizers with it to go to his toil in the mills or in the logging camps, but, instead, to come to Lake Charles and show the authorities that organized labor is against legalized murder. No one, the Union warned, shall upon that day allow himself to be intoxicated or enter into heated argument that may cause trouble. All weapons must be kept at home. No guns or rifles will be tolerated. Hundreds of Union members poured into Lake Charles. In keeping with the Brotherhood's instructions, they conducted a peaceable demonstration. 41. The prosecution filed a motion to sever the trial of the selected 9 defendants from that of the remaining 49. The motion was granted by the court. The chances of convicting the 9 were much greater than that of 58 men en bloc, and since the 9 selected were the most militant members of the Union, their conviction would achieve what the Southern Lumber Operators Association was after. As finally selected, the jury was composed of 7 farmers, a bill collector, a manager of a bottle works, a well oiler, a machinist, and a tram motorman. No Union man nor anyone who admitted to reading a labor or socialist paper was allowed to serve on the jury. 42. Judge E.G. Hunter, leading counsel for the defense, noted that the prosecution was not being conducted by the state of Louisiana, but rather by the Southern Lumber Operators Association. The state of Louisiana is nothing but a spectator in the trial. The real force is the Southern Lumbermen's Association's fight to break the Union. He noted, too, that the bulk of the evidence gathering and investigation was not conducted by investigative agencies of the state, but rather by a small army of operatives of the Burns International Detective Agency.
Hunter accused the detectives of having tampered with Venerman, endeavoring to find out where the sympathies of these prospective jurors lay, and informing attorneys for the prosecution so that those favorable to the defense could be peremptorily challenged.
These detectives, he made it clear, were being paid by the Employers Association. 48. The prosecution, headed by Congressman A. P. Pujo, it was calm. On knowledge that his fee was being paid by the Operators Association and not by the state, tried to prove 1. That the Union men, in unprovoked aggression at Grabo, had forced the company men to return their fire in self-defense, and 2. That this armed aggression was the outcome of a conspiracy previously planned by the defendants. But 22 witnesses for the defense swore that the first shot came from the office of the Galloway Lumber Company, and 7 of them swore that John Galloway, owner of the mill, himself fired the first shot. The prosecution was unable to shake their testimony on a single point. The state witnesses, James Ross and Shirley Buxton, testified completely in favor of the defense. Buxton swore that the first shot came from the office of the lumber company and that nearly all the gunmen were drunk when the Unionists had arrived at Grabo. The defense proved that the guards were drunk and were waiting to shoot Union men. A.T. Vincent, a guard who was killed, was proved to have been very drunk at the time of the shooting and had been heard to say several times that afternoon that he would like to kill him, a Union son of a bitch. No wonder the New Orleans Times-Democrat reported that some of the state's witnesses plainly disappointed the state. Pujo tried to overcome the weaknesses in the state's case by proving that the Brotherhood was a revolutionary organization bent on destroying Southern institutions. He offered as an exhibit the circular addressed to all Negro workers, and especially the Negro forest and lumber. 250. The industrial workers of the world turned to the theme in his final statement to the jury, in which he called the trial the most important issue to have confronted Louisiana since the days of Reconstruction. It is a question of whether we shall have social justice and civilization in Louisiana or anarchy.
I do not wish to accuse these defendants of being anarchists, but the things these men advocated prior to and leading up to the tragedy of Grabo will, if persisted in, lead to anarchy and bloodshed and the destruction of civilization and law and order.
It is for you, the jury, to decide whether the red hand of anarchy shall reach up and pull down the temples of justice and thwart the authority of constituted government. 46. In less than an hour after retiring, the jury, having taken but one ballot, returned a verdict of not guilty. Acquittal of these 9 defendants meant that a conviction of the 49 yet untried was impossible. District Attorney Moore moved that the court declare the charges against these 49 nolli prosequi. The court so ordered and the men were released. 47. The Maryville Strike.
A few hours after his release from prison, Emerson addressed a victory meeting at Union Hall in Lake Charles. It was evident from the first that this charge was trumped up by agents of the lumbermen, he told the assembled workers. They thought by this move they could ruin us of funds.
Of course it was successful in that respect. It has cost us an immense sum to maintain the families of the men in jail and the lawyers, and fight the case. 48 Emerson's point was well taken. Nevertheless, the outcome of the Frame UP was a major defeat for the Southern Lumber Operators Association. Even though they had deprived the Union of its militant core for months, the operators had failed to destroy the Brotherhood. An appeal was published in the Industrial Worker urging all lumberjack agitators in the Northwest who were footloose to head for the Southern Timber Belt and go to work in the camps to take up the work laid down by the many brave rebels who are in jail. A number of top organizers in the Northwest lumber camps, led by George Speed, moved into Louisiana in August 1912. They visited the men in jail, and then began organizing in Louisiana and Texas, setting up new locals and strengthening the existing ones.
Paying tribute to the assistance from their Union brothers from the Northwest, the Brotherhood announced, new applications began to pour in following the visit of organizers from the Northwest lumber camps, and the massacre of Grabo, far from shattering the Brotherhood, as the association hoped, has but produced a greater solidarity of labor. 49. There was some hope among the lumber workers that the verdict in the trial would bring peace in the area and that the terror for the time being will come to an end, but the association was not one to take its defeat lightly. On the day following the release of the Union men, news reports indicated that many of the large mills were already increasing their contingents of armed guards and erecting enclosures about their plants and employees' living quarters. Others were discharging Union men and evicting them from company houses. We paid every man in full and demanded our houses, the head of one mill said frankly. We are not in sympathy with the Brotherhood of Timber Workers and have no employment for them. 50.
The most vicious attack took place at the American Lumber Company at Maryville, La. The company employed around 1,300 men, all of them members of the Brotherhood, making Maryville a center of Union activity rivaled only by De Ritter. But shortly after the Grabo trial, the company was taken over by the Santa Fe Railway, and one of its first acts was to fire 15 of its Union employees who had participated, either as defendants or as witnesses, in the Grabo trial. The Brotherhood immediately appealed to Governor Luther E.
Hall of Louisiana to order the American Lumber Company and the Santa Fe Railroad to show cause why they should not be punished for contempt, since the men were being penalized for obeying the court's order. But the governor ignored the appeal, and the Brotherhood in a circular headed, Louisiana a rival to despotic Russia, declared bitterly, the state of Louisiana only indicts and arrests working men and working farmers.
Even now it is silent when lumber companies are discharging men practically for obeying the summons of the court to appear as witnesses in the Grabo trial. Yet we are told to respect the law, which, in Louisiana, has degenerated into nothing but the whim of a sawmill manager or landlord's overseer. Failing to get relief from the governor, the Brotherhood petitioned President William Howard Taft to ask of Congress the authority to intervene in Louisiana on the ground that a Republican form of government no longer existed in that state. As grounds for the petition, the
Brotherhood cited the fact that a clearinghouse for labor had been established and that no man today can secure employment in the southern lumber industry unless he takes an anti-union oath and signs an employment application blank, releasing everyone, except himself, from legal liability. It has, through this clearinghouse, blacklisted and hounded from state to state more than men, thereby causing them, their friends and families untold suffering. It holds thousands of other workers, especially the colored people, under conditions that are nothing short of peonage. The petition went on to cite the fencing in of whole towns, the importation of an army of gunmen of the lowest type, who were commissioned as deputy sheriffs and who freely attacked Union
members and sympathizers. It also cited the massacre at Grabo and the trial that followed, and the firing of workers who participated in any way in the trial. But the petition was ignored by President Taft. 51. On November 11, 9 days after the close of the Grabo trial, Jew Union men, whites, Indians, and Negroes, went on strike at the American Lumber Co. This was to be the biggest strike in the Brotherhood's history. Unfortunately, it came at a time when, as a result of the Grabo trial, the Union's resources were exhausted. Indeed, the leaders of the Brotherhood were convinced that the Operators Association, or more specifically, John H. Kirby, had precipitated the strike in order to draw the Union into a major conflict which it would find it exceedingly difficult to sustain. They had tried to avoid the strike by appealing to the governor, but when he refused to intervene, the Union men at the American Lumber Company, enraged at the reprisal against their brothers, felt that there was no alternative but to walk out. 52. Soon after the strike began, the company erected enclosures about the workers' shacks and the mills and began shipping in non-union crews, especially Negroes, from other parts of Louisiana and Texas, men who knew nothing of what had taken place in the mill. The Negro quarters were surrounded with a high barbed wire fence which was charged with electricity to keep the strikers from talking to the scabs. But the strikers did get to them nevertheless.
The railroad track was lined with pickets 4 miles on each side of the town, and as the trains carrying the scabs slowed down to enter Maryville, leaflets were thrown through the windows or on the platforms, pointing out the cause of the strike, and appealing to you colored wage workers of Louisiana and Texas to do your duty by the lumberjacks of Maryville, white, Indian and Negro members of Local 218, Brotherhood of Timber Workers, and stay away from the mills. 53.
The appeal brought results. Many Negroes refused to enter the mill, and quite a few joined the strikers, living with the families of Negro strikers. Foreign-born workers and Mexicans who were brought in as scabs also showed their solidarity with the strikers. As the Brotherhood pointed out in a statement that was widely published, "It is a glorious sight to see the miracle that has happened here in Dixie. This coming true of the impossible, this union of workers regardless of color, creed or nationality."
To hear the Americans saying, "You can starve us, but you cannot whip us," the Negroes crying, "You can fence us in, but you cannot make us scab," the Italians singing that a similar petition was sent by the Brotherhood to President Woodrow Wilson in May 1913, charging that a Republican form of government no longer exists in the state of Louisiana, and demanding that you exercise the authority vested in you by the Constitution to restore the same. New York Call, May 29, 1913. Again nothing resulted.
Marseillaise and the Mexicans shouting vivas for the Brotherhood. Never did the Santa Fe Railroad, the Southern Lumber Operators Association and the American Lumber Company expect to seek such complete and defiant solidarity. 64. In answer to the question, "Peons or men? Which shall we be?" the Negro and white strikers raised the battle cry of the lumberjacks of Dixie. Don't be a peon. Be a Monty. The Southern Lumber Operators
Association started this fight, they asserted as the 5th week of the strike opened, and we aren't going to carry it on till we get a man's life in every mill in Dixie. The unity of the Negro and white workers was so firm that one of the IWW organizers in the area cited it as a lesson for the entire working class which may feel proud of the solidarity displayed by these fighting timbermen and their wives and daughters. For be it known, that the many colored men belonging to Local 218, are standing pat with their white fellow slaves, and also be it known that the writer has realized for years that all the colored workers needed was for the white workers to meet them halfway, and they will always respond, eager and anxious to fight to better their conditions. He pointed out that even though not one of the 15 blacklisted workers had been a
Negro, our colored fellow workers showed their solidarity by walking out with their white comrades, and no amount of terror could induce them to scab. They were arrested and JRULED on different absurd charges, such as unlawfully meeting in the same hall with white men. They laughingly lined up and marched to the town hastile, singing the rebel songs they had learned at the daily mass meetings in the Union Hall, and despite threats, after their release, they appeared in greater number the next day to hear the speakers, and sing more songs to fan the flames of discontent. 55. Solidarity between strikers and farmers was also a feature of the struggle. When one worker told a meeting that even though he had 9 children, he was willing to strike, if the union can guarantee food for my children, the following dramatic episode occurred. When he made his plea for food for his family, every farmer in the audience rose and confirmed the pledge of the one Negro present, who said, "We farmers and workers will have to stick together in the Union and win this fight, or all of us, white and colored, are going back to slavery. I have so many pigs in my pen, so many head of cattle in the woods, so many chickens in the yard, and so many bushels of corn and sweet potatoes, and so many gallons of syrup in my barn, and pledge myself that so long as I have a pound of meat or a peck of corn, no man, white or colored, who goes out in this strike will starve, nor will his Negroes used as strikebreakers in this strike were brought in from outside of Maryville, and few knew what a union was. They were kept under constant surveillance of nigger killing deputy sheriffs. McQuinney, Op. Cit. Page 335. Children. And I believe all the white farmers here are ready to pledge the same. They did to a man, notes Covington Hall in his account of the incident. 56. Failing to break the strike by the usual methods till evictions, importing of scabs, most of whom refused to work when they learned the true state of affairs, attempted bribery of union leaders to induce them to quit the union, and threats of injunction, the company recruited a gang of strong-arm men. A characteristic, public-spirited committee, named the Good Citizens League, was formed by all the principal businessmen who followed the company's policy. The strong-arm men were taken into the league, and were also made deputy sheriffs. The company, in conjunction with the Good Citizens League and the city authorities, now launched its attack on the union. The deputies rambled around the town, molested Negro strikers, and ransacked their homes. On January 9, Robert Allen, a Negro striker, who had been one of the most faithful pickets, was arrested at a union meeting and taken away to jail. No warrant was served nor any reason given for the arrest. That same evening, Allen was placed in an automobile and deported from Maryville. The following night several other Str. Eakers received the same treatment. 117. The arrests and deportations reached a climax on Sunday, February 16, when mob violence broke loose against the strikers. 5 organizers were kidnapped, terribly beaten and deported on that day. 1. F. W. Oliver, a Negro, was shot, after being called a GD son of a Union nigger. The mob of 300, composed of businessmen, gunmen, and employees of the company had decided to make an example of Oliver so as to intimidate all Negro strikers. On February 18, a mob of gunmen and citizen leaguers proceeded to the Union headquarters, raided the office, seized all books and papers, and carried them into the offices of the American Lumber Co. That same day, the mob deported the acting secretary of the Union, tore down the tent in which the strikers' soup kitchen was run, and wrecked it, driving the women who were in attendance from it at the point of guns. On February 19, all remaining Union men in Maryville were deported under penalty of death if they returned. Union signs were torn off from shops and houses. Citizens were searched without a warrant, and anyone found with a Union leaflet or circular on him was arrested. The town of Maryville was now completely in the hands of the mob as company gunmen. Many deputized as sheriffs, armed with rifles, marched through the streets, terrorizing every family. 118. Into DeRidder, 20 miles away, there hobbled during these days of terror hundreds of Union members, bruised and sore from rifle beatings and the long hike. Although threatened with hanging if they returned, a number did hike back to Maryville to man the picket line. But the main job of picketing was carried on by the wives and daughters of the deported strikers. Meanwhile, the Union tried to get Governor Hall to do something to halt the reign of terror, pointing out that under the Civil Rights Bill, the town was liable for expulsion of even strangers without due process of law. But he refused to act.
The governor had sent the state militia into Maryville early in the strike at the request of the agents of the company.
The troops had been removed after it was discovered that the strikers were quiet and orderly, and replaced by deputy sheriffs, many of whom were on the payroll of the American Lumber Company and the Santa Fe. The governor refused to do anything to protect the rights of the organized workers. 119. The back of the strike had been broken by the 4-day wave of mob violence, but officially, it dragged on for 4 months, as it was not called off by the Union until May 1913. Most of the Negro and white strikers were refused re-employment and blacklisted throughout the entire Southern lumber industry. 0. Decline of B. of T.W. On May 19, 1913, the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, now renamed the Southern District of the National Industrial Union of Forest and Lumber Workers, IWW, met with the Western District in convention at Alexandria, Louisiana. It announced bravely that it had launched an official journal, The Lumberjack, a red-hot, fearless exponent of revolutionary unionism dealing particularly with the lumber industry, published at Alexandria, Louisiana. 61. But the weekly survived less than a year. The truth is that the defeat of the Maryville strike was the beginning of the Brotherhood's decline and the Union was in the throes of disintegration. The years of blacklisting, jailings, and mob violence had taken their toll. The Union lost its leader, A. L. Emerson, who left the Brotherhood after he received a severe beating in May 1913 at Singer, La, by a group of Santa Fe Guards. 62. His position of command was assumed by J. Smith, who continued as head of the organization for the rest of its active existence. On November 6, he published a revised version of the old list of Union demands. Most significant of these demands were 1. An 8-hour day. 2. A minimum wage of $2.50 a day. 3. Abolition of the discount system. 4. Pay of time and half for overtime and Sunday work. 5. Access to camps for Union delegates and organizers. 6. A Union-administered hospital insurance system and the right of the men to select their own doctors. Smith cautioned all locals against undertaking a strike action on their own initiative to secure these demands. He urged a waiting policy until the entire Union would be strong enough to call a general strike of timber workers, and appealed, "Unite, colored and white, for the purpose of making an industrial change." 163. But in little more than a month Local 275 went on strike, and this led to the last organized conflict between the members of the Brotherhood and the lumber operators. Local 275 in the fall of 1913 had organized the workers in the mill of the Sweet Home Lumber Company at Sweet Home Front, a small lumber camp a few miles north of Ball, La. After it had completely unionized the company and presented it with the union's list of demands, the employers took steps to break the union and to replace all members of the Brotherhood with non-union workers. The local called the entire crew, about 100 men, out on strike. In the latter part of March 1914, 4 members of Local 275 were arrested and jailed at Colfax on the charge of having shot a strikebreaker at Sweet Home Front with intent to kill. The trial, which lasted about a week, ended in the acquittal of all 4 defendants. The strike itself lasted until the middle of August when the men were forced to capitulate. G4. Although it continued to exist if only on paper until sometime in 1916, the Brotherhood was effectively destroyed by the spring of 1914. By this time, the operators had adopted a number of the union's demands in order to keep the workers from organizing. Abolition of payment in scrip, forced use of company stores and monthly payment in wages, small wage increases and shorter hours. G15. Sparrow and Harris view the efforts of the Brotherhood to organize Negro and white workers together as a major cause for its decline since it antagonized public opinion in the South and intensified employer opposition to the Union. Another student regards the decision to affiliate with the IWW as a major factor in the Union's decline since it gave the lumber operators a convenient means to misguide public opinion and to evoke that popular hysteria which the name IWW generally produced in the minds of substantial citizens. Greater than 66, but these arguments ignore the fact that even before the Brotherhood took so advanced a position on Negro and white unity and before it affiliated with the IWW, it was being attacked by the operators as a revolutionary, anarchistic organization. The truth is that the lumber kings wanted no unionism in the industry and had the power, together with the state apparatus which they controlled, to prevent it, from the standpoint of the laboring man. Bill Haywood declared in July 1912, in a speech in Louisiana, the lumber trust is more autocratic and vicious in its mandatory rule than any other employer of labor, greater than 67. To be sure, the Southern Lumber Operators Association, when it was frightened by the rapid growth of the Brotherhood, indicated a willingness to make a deal with the AF&L. But having destroyed the Brotherhood, the association saw no need to welcome the AF&L. Of course, the AF&L actually showed no real interest in replacing the Brotherhood as spokesman for the Negro and white loggers and sawmill workers in the South. But in 1919, greater than when progressive forces were making solid headway in the AF&L and achieving important gains in organizing the mass production industries, the Federation did attempt to carry on organizing work among the Southern timber workers. The AF&L unions met the same bitter opposition, brutal oppression, blacklisting and discrimination that had characterized the existence of the Brotherhood of Timber Workers. 38. The Brotherhood of Timber Workers left behind a noble tradition of militant struggle and labor solidarity, uniting Negro and white workers as never before in a Southern industry. This tradition, together with the improvements in conditions its struggles wrung from one of the most vicious and oppressive sections of the American capitalist class, remained long after the Union disappeared. Chapter 11. Migratory Farm Workers. The Wheatland Affair. Should small farmers be organized? In the initial number of the Lumberiac, January 1, 1913, the militant though short-lived organ of the Southern lumber workers, a leading article stressed the need for the IWW to launch an active campaign to organize the Southern tenant farmers who, it predicted, would prove to be our best fighting material. The article, reprinted in the Industrial Worker, provoked wide discussion in IWW circles as to whether or not farmers, small farmers and tenant farmers, should be allowed to join the organization. The editor of the Industrial Worker, noting that he had received an increasing number of letters from farmers, who bemoaned their inability to join us, suggested that the IWW should begin to think of organizing the small farmers and tenant farmers. 1. The editorial swamped the office with mail, so much so in fact that the editor claimed he could print only a few of the letters. Some came from farmers, several of whom insisted that the IWW ought to accept all those who were exploited, and that the family farmer, forced to buy and sell in a trustified market, represented about the worst exploited class in the whole country. A number of Wobblies agreed that the IWW should attempt to arrive at a working agreement with some farmers, perhaps the small farmer, at the very least the tenant farmer. Others suggested that the small and tenant farmers ought to organize a union of their own and become attached to the IWW as a sort of fraternal organization, along the lines of the IWW propaganda leagues. But the majority sentiment expressed was opposed to any association between the IWW and farmers. The economic interests of farmers, large, small, and tenant, most Wobblies argued, were not identical with 258 farm laborers, hence to admit them into the IWW would blur the class nature of the organization. Indeed, the IWW might become like the Socialist Party, which had lost its revolutionary fervor because it accepts everyone to membership on a profession of faith, regardless of their economic interests, and aimed a good deal of its propaganda at farmers on the erroneous theory that they were among the most revolutionary forces in America. One letter noted, "The tenant farmer is a producer, Anyone who adds use value to a commodity is a producer. The 1WW is not a producers' union, it is a wage workers' union. If the tenant farmers are revolutionary, carrying an IWW card will not make them more so. Better a few revolutionary tenant farmers without cards than thousands of hopeful, capitalist-minded, dues-paying members. One small California group of agricultural workers, while admitting that the small farmers were exploited by the capitalist system, nevertheless opposed membership for them. Small farmers may treat their slaves in a more familiar or democratic manner than the big employer, but any man who has worked on both bonanza farms and for petty farmers not much better off than himself, knows he is better off on the big farm. 2. The official position of the IWW, as it emerged from the discussion, was to organize the farm laborers, many of whom were nomadic workers, line them up against the farm owners for higher wages and better conditions, and build powerful industrial unions of agricultural laborers which would not only function effectively in harvest times, but would educate and train the farm laborers for their subsequent operation and control of the agricultural industry. Under no circumstance should farmers be allowed to affiliate directly or indirectly with the IWW. In due time, the combined operation of monopoly capitalism and of the industrial union of agricultural workers will tend rapidly to make the small farm owner's position untenable. His eligibility to membership in the IWW will not then be open to question. 4. Early efforts to organize agricultural workers. While the theoretical discussion was being waged in the IWW press, Wobblies were recruiting agricultural laborers in the main labor markets in California, the Northwest, and the Dakotas. And few workers in the country were in greater need of organization. A study of California labor camps described the average accommodations provided for farm laborers in these terms. Ranch after ranch was devoid of accommodations given horses. When a Mexican asked for shelter, he was told that he had the sky for a roof. When he asked for water, he was referred to the ditches to drink from and in which to bathe. He slept on the warm side of a levee, huddled like a dog, often without blankets. If he boarded himself, he cooked in the open. He always drank from ditches, and the water in these ditches is liquid mud. Further comment is not needed, but a few resulting facts may be stated. Communicable diseases were rife in the camps. Dysentery, diarrhea, and typhoid were common. 11. Sporadic efforts to unionize the migratory workers had been made by the AFL before the IWW actively entered upon the scene, but little was accomplished. The only real attempt by the AFL to organize the agricultural laborers took place in California in 1911, and then it was designed to favor white workers at the expense of the Orientals. The AFL organizers in Fresno, where the drive took place, openly appealed to the employers that by recognizing the United Laborers of America, they could eliminate the Japanese employed in harvesting grapes and replace them with white workers who eat American food and spend their money here. But the attempt failed, and the unionizing drive was soon abandoned. 6. As Stuart Jameson notes in his study, Labor Unionism in American Agriculture, the organizing drive of the AFL came to little. The migratory and casual workers were difficult to hold for any length of time in an organization that appealed primarily to a minority of skilled workers. Casual farm laborers whose work was seasonal and poorly paid could not afford regular union dues even when set by the AFL at an especially low level, and the dues which could be collected from the workers were not sufficient to maintain the staff of organizers needed to keep a union functioning effectively. 7. The harvest is ripe. The IWW press appealed in 1910. Let us all work with a determination to bring every farm laborer into the fold of the IWW. During the next year, the Wobbly Press reported organizing activity in Minnesota, Colorado, the Dakotas, Washington, and California, and claims were even advanced of IWW success in getting a wage rate of $3 per 12-hour day for groups of wheat harvesters. But in 1912 the number of agricultural workers in the ranks of the LWW was so insignificant that they were not even included in a breakdown of the membership's occupations made by Vincent Street John, General Secretary. 8. The truth is that the organizing tactics of the LWW in agriculture during this period were no more successful than those used by the AFL. Writing from Tulare, Caliph, in the midst of an alfalfa harvest, a wobbly organizer urged greater effort among the migrant farm workers, predicting that we could practically own California in 5 years if the proper organizing methods were employed. Unfortunately, the fellow workers moved about the country too much to be able to conduct continuous organizing drives. Moreover, the strategy of waiting for the agricultural laborer to blow into town during the off-season and then recruiting him into the LWW proved to be no more effective in terms of a lasting membership than it did with the lumber workers. While the IWW claimed thousands of members in California agriculture during 1912, the Wobbly Press conceded that many of them had been recruited in lumber camps and railroad construction gangs, where they worked before the harvest season, that a large number moved in and out of the organization and were not formal members in the sense of paying dues to any local organizations, and that it was difficult, under these circumstances, to organize an effective drive to improve working conditions in the agricultural fields. 9. In order to improve the organizing work among the farm migrants, the Spokane Local initiated the delegate system. These camp delegates were to be given full organizers' responsibilities in handling initiation blanks, dues books and dues stamps, and were to be held responsible to their local unions for the care of this material as well as for all literature furnished them for sale. The delegate system was not immediately successful among the workers in the grain fields, although, as we shall see below, it brought in thousands of new members in 1915-16. But it did result, by the end of 191, in producing more effective results in California agriculture. Delegates were sent from San Francisco, Oakland, Fresno, and Bakersfield, where the WW had strong locals, into the fields to organize workers on the job and lead them in job action strikes. These job delegates would speedily become the spokesmen for the farm laborers and present their grievances to the ranch foreman. Behind them stood a group of militant workers, already members of the IWW, and ready for strike action if steps were not taken to remedy the grievance. Once the strike started, a majority of the workers on the ranch would join the walkout and become members of the IWW-10. The Wheatland Strike. The free speech fights had considerably enhanced the prestige of the IWW among the agricultural workers. Then on August 3, 1913, on the ranch of the Durst brothers at Wheatland near Marysville, Calif., an event occurred which was to make the IWW the undisputed spokesman for the agricultural workers of the entire Pacific Coast. More than any other event, the so less than old Wheatland Hopfields riot, the largest agricultural strike in California up to this time, brought to public attention the brutal exploitation of these migratory workers and the intolerable conditions under which these people worked at the TIMC. 11. As was the usual custom of all large-scale ranchers, Durst brothers, millionaire hop growers, advertised in newspapers throughout California, Southern Oregon, and Nevada to secure labor for the harvest season of 1913. Although they later admitted that they could provide employment for only about 1,500 workers, and that living arrangements were inadequate for even that number, in order to depress wages they had sent out advertisements offering to employ at least 3,000 pickers. The advertisements invited all who wished to enjoy a picnic and pick hops to assemble at the Durst camp. About 2,800 workers, men, women and children, Syrians, Mexicans, Hawaiians, Japanese, Lithuanians, Italians, Greeks, Poles, Hindus, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans, speaking among them 27 different languages, answered the colorful advertisements and poured into the Durst camp by every conceivable means of transportation. They found immediately that although Durst advertised that they would receive the going wage of $1 per 100 pounds, this was not the case at all. For one thing, the Dursts required cleaner picking than most ranchers, making it harder for the workers to get credit for 100 pounds. For another, they kept 10 cents out of each dollar per 100 pounds to be paid at the end of the harvest. This sum was forfeited if the workers left before the end of the season. Due to the Durst's method of withholding pay and their requirement for especially clean picking, workers on the ranch would rarely earn more than $1.50 per day for 12 or more hours as compared with $3 on other hop ranches. The Dursts knew what they were doing when they withheld part of the wages until the harvest was over. Conditions in the camp were so abominable that few workers could be expected to complete the season, thus forfeiting a large sum of money to the rancher. The workers paid 75 cents a week for tents rented from Durst. But there were no blankets provided even for the 1,000 women and children, and the workers, sleeping on straw piled on the floors, huddled together for warmth. Many slept in the fields. Food was so sparse and poor in quality that most of the workers were soon suffering from hunger. There were 9 toilets for 2,800 people, and they were used indiscriminately by men, women and children so that by the end of the second day, they were covered by filth. There were no toilets in the fields and the workers were forced to use the vines for their toilets. Within 3 days, the fields, too, were in a filthy condition. No provision was made to take care of the garbage, and the toilets were used as garbage receptacles. Despite the fact that the temperature rose as high as 122 degrees in the hop fields, no water was available to the pickers. To get a drink, a worker had to walk a mile or a mile and a quarter. And this was piecework. Durst sold acetic acid lemonade to the workers at 5 cents a glass. In this terrible heat, with drinking water almost inaccessible, the Dursts had eliminated certain practices which heretofore had made the work much easier for the women and children. As one hop picker explained to a reporter for the Sacramento Bee, a German foreman recently introduced in the fields by Durst conceived the idea of economizing by doing away with the high pull men, the fellows who detach the hop vines from the highest wires for the women and children. Under the new system, the women and children have to reach the hops, no matter how high the growth, must carry filled sacks weighing 80 to 100 pounds to the scales, and then load them on the wagon, no matter how high. Heretofore the high pull men operated 2 to each row, and the weighing of the hops and the loading into the wagons was part of their duty. 3 days after the 2 workers had arrived, a dangerous epidemic ran through the camp. Many workers were ill with typhoid as well as dysentery. 12. In this situation, crying for correction, a small group of wobblies began to take action. There were no more than 100 IWW card men among the entire labor force at the Durst Ranch, many of them veterans of the Spokane, Fresno, and San Diego free speech fights. About 30 of these organized a local, and these men, led by Richard Ford, better known as Blackie Ford, and Herman D. Sir, began to urge the workers to take some action to better their conditions. A mass protest meeting was called on Saturday evening, August 2nd, followed by another one, Sunday morning. Ford and Sir and a few other wobblies were elected as a committee to present 10 demands to the ranch owners. These called for an improvement of conditions, including, in particular, drinking water to be furnished in the fields twice a day, reinstatement of the high pull men, improved sanitary conditions in the camps, especially separate toilets for men and for women, and a flat rate of $1.25 per hundred of hops picked. The meeting would await the report of the delegation, and if nothing concrete emerged from the conference with the Dursts, there would be a strike. Ralph Durst promised vaguely to improve camp conditions, but refused the committee's demands to raise wages and to reinstate the high pull men, claiming that past experience had proved it unnecessary. When he was given an hour to reconsider his refusal to yield on the question of wages, Durst fired the leaders of the committee, and ordered them to call for their pay and vacate the premises. When the committee replied that unless there was immediate action to improve conditions and adjust wages to the going scale, there would be a strike, Durst hit Ford, its spokesman, with a heavy glove, and called in the local constable. The latter, gun in hand, ordered Ford off the ranch. A little later, the constable tried to arrest Ford, but when he failed to produce a warrant, the pickers blocked his efforts. Pickers, men, women, and children, gathered on and about a dance platform, were singing wobbly songs between listening to the speakers. Meanwhile, Durst had telephoned the authorities for help, informing them that the WW leaders were causing much feeling by the anarchistic speeches they were making. 2 cars, loaded with armed men, led by the constable, the sheriff and the district attorney, arrived from Marysville at the meeting just as the crowd was singing the famous wobble song, Mr. Block, as the sheriff and his deputies went forward to arrest Ford, who was on the platform. The crowd closed in to prevent the arrest. One deputy sheriff, George Voss, fired a shot in the air, and others began threatening to shoot the workers, women as well as men. A general melee ensued, during which District Attorney E.T. Manuel, Deputy Sheriff Eugene Reardon, and 2 unidentified hop pickers, one Puerto Rican and the other English, were killed. Many hop pickers were injured. Even the Marysville Appeal, the local newspaper, conceded the next day that it was difficult to tell exactly what had actually occurred, for although a number of people saw the shooting, their stories varied considerably. A reporter for the Sacramento Union wrote from Wheatland on August 4. The firing of a revolver in the air by Sheriff George Voss, when he sought to add emphasis to his command, together with the sudden breaking of a railing throwing a mass of striking hop pickers upon the sheriff and his posse, cost the 4 lives that were blotted out on the Durst Hop Ranch here yesterday afternoon, a tragedy that might have easily been averted and which probably would, had not these circumstances occurred together. This version of the fatal riot is given not only in the statements of several witnesses of both sides, but also by a signed statement given out today by Ralph H. Durst, one of the owners of the Durst Ranch, an eyewitness. 13. Following the shooting, the sheriff's posse fled and left the ranch in control of another posse of armed citizens until the state militia arrived the next morning from Sacramento. Actually, only a few of the people on the ranch waited for the militia to arrive. The majority, terrified, had fled in all directions as soon as they could get away. Jack London, who met many of the fleeing hop pickers in Sonoma County, wrote that they reminded him of nothing so much as the refugees after the earthquake. When I did get one of them to tell about the affair, they all spoke of it as an accident, a spontaneous, unpremeditated explosion. 14. 8 of the hop pickers who remained in Wheatland were immediately arrested, and a statewide manhunt of the others who had dispersed began immediately, the local authorities employing Burns detectives to aid them. Echoing Ralph H. Durst's statement that Wheatland's Bloody Sunday was entirely due to the WW element, the local press called for the arrest for murder of every wobbly member who had been on the Durst Ranch. It was not necessary to prove their guilt. They were guilty by their very nature. These venomous human snakes, raged the Marysville Democrat on August 4, always urged armed resistance to constituted authority. These human animals are more dangerous and deadly than the wild animals of the jungles. 111. Yet 2 days later, the only time during the entire Wheatland affair, the Marysville Democrat put its finger on just who and what was responsible for the tragedy. The lead article in the paper opened, "As the situation begins to clear up, it becomes more evident that the real cause of the trouble lies with the hop growers. IWW agitators, to be sure, had stirred up the hop pickers, but had the Durst brothers evinced the slightest interest in the welfare of the men, women and children on their ranch, the great majority of the pickers would have had no reason to listen to the wobbly leaders. It was clear, however, that the workers could not make a living, that twice as many workers had been induced by the Dursts to come to their ranch as could be supplied with work, that the hop pickers could not make any money at the price paid, that there was no water provided even though people who pick hops all day and the day means from 12 to 14 hours get very dry and need lots of water and they want it fresh too, and that conditions in the field were generally bad. It was clear, too, that the Dursts felt that, so long as there were so many people on the grounds that these people needed work badly and would be glad to stay at any price, and so they did not trouble themselves to pay heed to demands for better conditions. This is something that should be looked after by the state authorities, as the conditions prevailing in the fields would soon become unhealthy and be a menace to the public. 16. The Roundup. The logical conclusion from all this, of course, was that the Durst brothers should have been indicted both for murder and for having created a public menace. But, despite the evidence it had presented, the Democrat held that the real cause of the trouble was the IWW. And the coroner's jury, meeting in Marysville on August 7, blamed the IWW for the death of District Attorney Manuel on the ground that he had been shot by a gun in the hand or hands of rioters incited to murderous anger by IWW leaders and agitators. We therefore strongly recommend that the Yuba County officers do all in their power to capture one Blackie Ford and all other guilty parties. The jury, announced the Marysville Democrat, based its verdict largely on the testimony of Ralph Durst, 17. California and neighboring states were plastered with notices that Blackie, or Shorty, Ford and H.D. Sir were wanted by the sheriff's office at Marysville, Calif, on charge of murder committed at Wheatland, Calif, on the 3rd day of August, 1913. At the same time, arrests of hop pickers who had been at Wheatland were carried out. Deputy sheriffs and Burns detectives were given free license to handle prisoners as they saw fit, and many were severely beaten, tortured, and held incommunicado for weeks. Alfred Nelson, arrested and charged with complicity in the Wheatland riot, even though he had been 2 blocks away from the shooting, was dragged about the state from one county to another, sweated, starved, beaten up, and repeatedly threatened with death by a deputy sheriff and a Burns detective unless he confessed to his share in the crime. At Martinez, Nelson was taken from the jail to a room in a hotel, and there the sheriff and private detective beat him with their revolvers and a rubber hose and threatened to shoot him unless he confessed. He refused and was returned to jail more dead than alive. Martinez's district attorney, A.B. Mackenzie, after investigating the incident on Nelson's appeal, called it one of the biggest outrages that has ever been perpetrated in this state. This man has been dragged from county to county, from one jail to another, and then taken out and beaten up. Nelson was a native of Sweden, and the Swedish consulate at San Francisco, shocked by his story, lodged a protest with the authorities. 18. Edward Glazer, a 15-year-old boy and a hop picker on the Durst Ranch, was seized by a Burns detective who tried to force him to say that he saw Sir with a revolver on the day of the riot. When Glazer refused, he was arrested, taken from jail to jail, beaten, placed on a bread and water diet, and kept in prison for weeks without examination, with his whereabouts kept secret from his family. When his uncle asked to see the boy, he was refused permission, and only succeeded in securing his release by petitioning for a writ of habeas corpus. Chief Justice Beatty, in a scathing comment on the way the boy was treated, declared, "The thing that strikes me is, it is very irregular practice under our law, in view of the provisions of the Penal Code, to hold a man under a criminal charge for a month without examination, and in the meantime refuse permission to those who wanted to see him in jail. He had been held there for weeks, and the law requires an examination to be held immediately when a man is under arrest. I know something of the ways of detectives in regard to prisoners in the variety of cases that come before this court, and I know they set a defiance in detaining people without authority and keeping them secluded, and in the meantime subjecting them to the 3rd degree. 19. Mackenzie was so infuriated that he charged the private detective with assault under color of his authority as an officer. The Burns detective was convicted following a jury trial, and given 1 year in jail and a fine of $R. The jury was out less than 20 minutes. Natchez Standard, November 2, 1913, in Scrapbooks of Clippings on the Wheatland Hopfield Riots, Wheatland, California, 1913 to 1915, University of California Library, Berkeley. Hereinafter cited as W.S. Niels Nelson, arrested in the roundup, was tortured so frequently to extort a confession that he committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell in Yuba County Jail. Another arrested hop picker attempted suicide, and still another was committed to the insane asylum. 20. Herman Sir was arrested in Arizona, brought to California, secretly spirited from one jail to another to evade his attorney, and kept without adequate food and without sleep under constant torture for an entire week. On the point of collapse, he confessed to shooting 2 members of the sheriff's posse. When he was able to get 2 hours of sleep, he repudiated the confession. 21. Arrest and trial of Ford and Sir. Finally, out of the men arrested, the 2 leading IWW organizers on the Durst Ranch, Ford and Sir, and 2 others, Walter Bagan and William Beck, were charged with being accessories to the murder. All 4 were to be tried at the same time in the Marysville courthouse. Austin Lewis, the socialist lawyer, and R.M. Royce, attorneys for the defendants, immediately asked for a change of venue, charging that a fair and impartial trial could not take place in Marysville. First, because of the bitter prejudice against the IWW. Second, because Judge E. P. McDaniel was a personal friend of the slain district attorney, as was the new DA, Edward B. Stanwood, and third, because the son of the late district attorney was associated with the prosecution. The request was denied. Governor Johnson likewise rejected a plea to appoint another judge at the trial. 22. On September 25, 1913, delegates to the 9th Annual Convention of the IWW in Chicago heard of the arrest of Ford and Sir on murder charges. They immediately voted to hold a meeting to raise a defense fund for the 2 wobbly leaders and the other prisoners in Marysville and to arouse the working class of the country to rally to their support. In California, the Wheatland Hop Pickers Defense League was organized, soon to be assisted by the International Workers' Defense League. The 2 organizations raised funds to help the defense. By February 14, 1914, $5, S73.68 had been collected and sponsored meetings to arouse support for the men in prison, especially among trade unions and socialist locals. Resolutions of protest were adopted by the San Francisco Labor Council, the Oakland Building Trades Council, the California State Federation of Labor, and a number of labor organizations and socialist groups in Los Angeles and other cities of California. 23 inches over 100,000 working men have protested, announced the Sacramento Star. The IWW denied that Nelson had committed suicide, and charged that he had been beaten to death. Sacramento B, December 1, 1913, W.S. As early as November 2, T913, a month later, the San Francisco Chronicle noted in surprise that the case was assuming international importance, as protests were pouring in from trade unions in Canada. It added, hundreds of letters have been received by the Yuba County officials from labor unions throughout the United States that are interesting themselves in the approaching trial. 2i. The Marysville press was amazed at the protests pouring into the community. As Austin Lewis correctly noted, the fact that this hobo has a mind or a soul is surprising to these big farmers. The fact that he has friends is astounding. 25. All over the labor world in this continent, wailed the Marysville appeal. The imprisoned suspects are held as martyrs to the cause of labor. It warned AFL unions to refrain from further protests lest the public get the wrong idea and confuse them with the one. W.26 When the First Congregational Church of Oakland, whose members were the most prominent leaders in the business circles, denounced the inhuman and unfair treatment of the men involved in the Hopfield riots, and called upon Governor Johnson to investigate, even the Marysville Democrat was impressed. This is the first time in the history of the state, it declared in awe, that a large and representative congregation has taken up a fight on behalf of organized labor. 27 Although the Marysville Women's Club coldly rejected a plea from the International Workers' Defense League to investigate charges of brutality against the prisoners and the unbearable conditions in the hop fields that were responsible for the Wheatland riot, and to ask the state authorities to use their powers to see that justice is accorded to the prisoners, many other women's clubs in California responded favorably to this plea. 28. As quietly as though it had been an ordinary civil case, instead of a murder trial attracting nationwide attention among the various classes of people, the trial commenced in the Superior Court before Judge E. P. McDaniel announced the Marysville Democrat on January 12, 1914. For weeks the Marysville papers had predicted an LWW invasion to kidnap the prisoners as soon as they entered the courtroom, and had advised citizens to arm themselves against the invaders. Hence the emphasis on the quietness of the opening day of the trial. Actually, a wobbly invasion of Marysville did occur, but it was so quiet and dignified that it aroused respect and admiration for the IWW even from quarters heretofore bitterly hostile to the organization. 29. That same issue of the Star carried a detailed exposé of the brutal methods used to punish penniless workers charged with murder in connection with the recent Wheatland riots. The article caused the Sacramento Bee, a more important and influential paper, to assign its crack reporter, C. K. McClathy Jr. to investigate the matter. His findings, published in the Bee, helped arouse support for the prisoners. Sacramento Bee, January 14, 1914, W.S. On the eve of the trial, 60 IWW members and a handful of sympathizers arrived in the neighborhood of Marysville. When asked why they came, plodding through storms, on freight trains, singly and in groups, giving up jobs, unmindful of personal advantage, the answer was, So the hop pickers on trial here, industrial comrades, shall know that they are not without friends. They pooled their dimes and dollars, and hired an old house on the outskirts of Marysville, the defense camp, as it was called. They bound themselves not to drink, and fed and took care of themselves. They spent their evenings washing and mending, playing cards, chess, solitaire, reading books borrowed from the Marysville Public Library, discussing theory and singing wobbly songs. Every morning at 10, however, and every afternoon at 2, after removing from their coat lapels and jacket fronts the green buttons inscribed, "Justice for the Hoppickers," they marched into court and sat quietly throughout the proceedings. Whenever Austin Lewis needed a witness for the defense, he would hand a slip of paper to one of the IWW men in the courtroom. The latter would then turn it over to a wobbly outside the courtroom who would board a freight train to search for the desired witness. 80. The L.W.W. jungle in Marysville became almost as well known as the trial itself. Reporters, social workers, club women, and writers attending the trial made it a practice to visit the defense camp, and they were invariably impressed by what they saw in contrast to what they had believed or been led to believe about the Wobblies. "Good citizens of Marysville had warned me not to pass this house at night. It harbored dangerous men, ruffians, they said," explained one reporter. Instead, he found young men from the mines, the woods, factories, even from colleges, clean-cut boys with eager faces and level glances, sitting, in the light of candles, about a long table of planks, supported by sawbucks, discussing some tenet in their creed of solidarity and economic justice for the world's toilers, and singing songs which drifted across to the county jail where the hop pickers on trial for murder are confined. And on not one breath could he smell the taint of liquor. "We cannot fight the booze and fight the laboring man's battle," he was informed. "We do not drink. You haven't noticed any of us in the saloons uptown. Not one Marysville saloon will be enriched by a nickel from our pockets." 31. The trial itself was featured by repeated appeals by the judge and prosecution to stir up feeling against the defendants solely on the ground of membership in the L.W.W. Judge McDaniel referred scornfully to the term "wobblies" used by Sir in his telegram for help in the Wheatland strike. "We have a right," he told the jury, "to mistrust any body of people that speaks a language not understood by civilized folks." District Attorney Stanwood produced in court an ominous-looking little red book, and from it read the words of Mr. Pickers were singing, under Ford's direction, just before the riot. It was introduced as evidence by the prosecution, to show the hatred entertained by the defendant toward anything and everybody above his own standard. But it was not the song itself that was so suggestive, noted the Marysville Appeal, as it was the flaming red covers of the book wherein it was contained. On the front page in bold type there was a key to the contents of the book, which read, "Industrial Workers of the World Songs to Fan the Flames of Discontent." The purpose of the prosecution was clear. It was in keeping with the plan of the state to prove the anarchistic creed and hatred of government of the defendants. 32. The testimony of the witnesses for the prosecution laid stress on the fact that Ford and Sir were agitators. Not even the most hostile witnesses testified that he had seen Blackie Ford with a gun. Indeed, the prosecution admitted that he probably had not done the shooting, but that by stirring up the hop pickers he had filled the magazines of wrath. Although Sir's confession was not introduced, a fact which proved that it had been obtained by third-degree methods, 33 deputies testified that Sir had confided to them that he had taken a gun from the hands of an old man while fleeing from the M.Lee and had fired twice. This Sir denied, and the deputies did not claim to have seen Sir actually shoot the slain men. Those who had actually seen the shooting, the hop pickers themselves, testified that the unidentified Puerto Rican had shot Manuel and Reardon with the revolver he had seized from the latter. In his speech to the jury, Austin Lewis, concluding the case for the defense, emphasized, "None of the defendants took part in the shooting. None was seen with a gun in his hands. None advised or abetted violence. Nothing in the evidence points to conspiracy, much less proves it, but, as Inez Haynes Gilmore pointed out in Harper's Weekly, Marysville wanted to teach the WW to stay away from Yuba County." On January 31, 1914, the jury acquitted Bagan and Beck, two of the four men on trial, and convicted Ford and Sir of second-degree murder. The theory behind the conviction was that they were guilty of conspiracy to murder Manuel by leading the strike which resulted in the shooting and by urging the workers not to permit the officers to arrest them. Judge McDaniel sentenced Ford and Sir to life imprisonment in Folsom Penitentiary. Bail was denied pending appeal. 34. A storm of protest swept California and large parts of the nation. Letters and telegrams poured in upon the officials of Yuba County from all sections of the United States, condemning the verdict and the sentence and calling for a new trial. 3 weeks after the end of the trial, the Timbs of a frame UP engineered by the wealthy hop ranchers. The appeal was indignant over the manner in which organized labor is contributing to the defense fund of the Wheatland Hopfield murderers. Sis. Meanwhile, a special committee of the California Commission of Immigration and Housing, headed by Dr. Carlton Parker of the University of California, had been investigating the causes of the strike on the Durst Ranch and its tragic aftermath. In his report to Governor Johnson, made public in February 1914, Drive, Parker laid bare the miserable living and sanitary conditions on the Durst Ranch, and while he refused to pass judgment on whether Ford and Sir were guilty, he did point out, the question of what persons were guilty of the murder seems, in comparison with the deeper social and economic responsibility, of insignificant importance. The posse was, I am convinced, over-nervous and unfortunately over-rigorous. Dr. Parker did not approve of the IWW nor its ideology and tactics. He believed that the new methods used by the Wobblies in labor struggles posed a danger for organized society, but he felt that the LWW was expressing the legitimate grievances of the migratory workers and was, in the absence of any other interested labor group, not only their recognized spokesman but would continue to grow among these and other unorganized workers if their conditions were not improved. The IWW leaders, Drive, Parker wrote, have volunteered the beginning of a cure. It is to clean up the housing and wage problem of the seasonal worker. 36. The findings of the California Commission on Immigration and Housing were supplemented and given even wider publicity by the investigations made by the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations. Hearings were held in San Francisco late in August 1914 concerning the Wheatland affair. The evidence taken fully exposed the conditions on the Durst Ranch and bore out all the previous charges that suspects arrested in connection with the case were brutally mistreated by Tilda-Rive detective agencies in full cooperation with the county authorities. 1. The state and federal investigations aroused new support for the Ford and Sir defense campaign. But the IWW, while welcoming the investigations, reminded the migratory workers that scientific reports, like sympathetic resolutions, do not fight working-class battles or settle working-class battles or settle working-class wrongs. Direct action on the job was the only real way to redress the grievances of the hop workers and free Ford and Sir. 38. In a minority report, Paul Scharnberg of the California State Federation of Labor, who was secretary of the State Commission, took exception to the idea that the IWW had introduced anything new to the labor movement, that it was growing in influence, and that it had anything constructive to offer the workers. IWW-ism, he concluded, is possible only among unorganized workers, a statement with which most IWW leaders would have agreed, although they would have added that due to the indifference of the AFL, the unorganized workers remained unorganized. Sacramento B. May 30, 1914, W.S. The 1914 strike. Immediately after the Marysville trial, the IWW launched a mass campaign, under the direction of Mortimer Downing, its ace publicity man, to protest the judicial crime, and to demand the release of Ford and Sir. It was conducted on 2 levels. 1. Appeal to the higher courts of California and for support in the form of letters and telegrams to Governor Johnson demanding a new trial. 2. General strike action. In the spring of 1914, the IWW press carried the following notice, headed, Hop Pickers, Attention. Our demands for season 1914. X. Ford and Sir to be given a new trial at once and dismissed, or no crops will be picked. 2. Minimum of $1.25 per 100 pounds. 3. Free tents. 4. Free drinking water in the fields. 5. High pole men. 6. Men to help women and children lift heavy sacks into wagons. 7. 1 toilet for every 50 men, women and children. 8. Women's toilets to be on opposite side of camps from men's toilets. 9. Abolition of bonus graft. Hop pickers are requested to boycott every field that does not grant all these demands before picking commences. Hop pickers general strike. Committee. 39. The AFL councils in Sacramento, San Diego, and Fresno endorsed the strike call. August 1, 1914, was set as the day for the general strike for the release of the jailed wobbly leaders and the redress of grievances of the pickers. Leaflets were distributed through the agricultural region of California appealing, do not pick any hops and Ford and Sir will be free. Don't scab on men in jail. Let the hops rot. On each leaflet was a picture of the wooden shoe. Hundreds of thousands of stickers carrying similar messages were plastered on trees and fences. 40. All over California the hop growers were alarmed over the impending strike, and Yuba County, especially Wheatland, was the center of considerable agitation. The Marysville press called upon the state to protect the hop growers of the county, and urged the citizens to organize vigilance committees and apply that stripe of justice which, in the early days of California, cleared the atmosphere through the punctuation of the landscape with dangling bodies suspended from brave oaks or gallant cycas. An interesting aspect of the AFL support was the decision of the Japanese hop pickers to withdraw from the campaign, in which they had been active from the start, on the ground that if they were to cooperate openly, the whites would lose what support they had from the AFL because of the anti-Oriental sentiment of that organization. Instead, the Japanese workers published advertisements in the Japanese language papers calling upon their countrymen to stay away from the hop fields until Ford and Sir were released. Stuart Jameson, Lab 01. Unionism in American Agriculture, Washington, D.C., 1945, page 62. Solidarity, July 24, 1915. Mores. The appeal warned the WW to call off the strike, or take a chance with an outraged and law-abiding public whose feeling is such that it isn't friendly to these nefarious outlaws who live by begging, stealing and pillaging. 41. The warnings and threats had no effect on the IWW. Nor did the news that the ranchers were organizing private armies of gunmen. At every railroad station in the hop section, small bands of IWW members, equipped with bundles of leaflets, were gathered, ready to begin picketing the ranches. On August 1st, 3 big ranches in the Wheeland area were closed down by continuous picket lines. One of the first was the Durst Ranch. During the next 10 days, the strike spread over the state. On August 10, 75 IWW members left Sacramento for the Durst hop fields at Wheeland to join the picket line. We have the word of the transport loaders of England. They informed reporters that they will not unload hops sent to Liverpool from California. But the hops will never get that far. If they ever leave the Durst Ranch, they will not reach New York by freight trains. 42. By the end of September, the Hop Pickers Defense Committee estimated that, owing to the action of the IWW, the hop crop is 24,000 bales short, and that partly due to the general strike and partly to the boycott put on the hop fields by the IWW. It is a very conservative estimate to state that the hop crop was damaged $500,000. The total hop crop is valued at $5 million, so any workers who want to figure can see what a tremendous fine has been leveled upon the hop barons. Although many California newspapers challenged this estimate, they conceded that the strike had brought the Ford and Sir case to a wide public and had added to the disclosures of the abominable conditions of the migratory workers. 43. But the strike failed to bring about the freedom of Ford and Sir. On September 10, 1914, the appellate court denied the defendants a new trial, and 2 months later, the state Supreme Court denied their petition for a rehearing of the cases. So far as the state of California was concerned, the last chance of freeing Ford and Sir through appeals to the courts was closed. But shortly after the Supreme Court's denial of a new trial, the Marysville Democrat reported angrily that some misguided labor unions, whose members know nothing of the real facts but are actuated solely by misplaced sympathy, have started a petition asking Governor Johnson to pardon these arch conspirators. 44. Meanwhile, the Hop Pickers Defense Committee was gathering new evidence to present to Governor Johnson revealing how Ford and Sir had been railroaded to prison. The committee was able to secure statements from most of the jurymen that they had been unduly influenced by the hysteria that swept Marysville during the trial. 45. In February 1915, an application for pardon, covering 78 printed pages, was presented to Governor Johnson. It was backed by labor unions in most of the large cities of the state, all the central bodies of the A.F. of L in the San Francisco Bay District and the A.F. of L. Council of Alameda County. 46. On March 5, 1915, the hearing for a pardon took place before Governor Johnson. Among the speakers were representatives of the A.F. of L. unions, the IWW, society and club women, professional men, city, county, and state officials, and migratory workers. Supervisor Andrew J. Gallagher told the governor, the only charge that could justly have been lodged against Ford and Sir was that of being agitators. Paul Scharnberg, secretary of the California State Federation of Labor, endorsed Gallagher's statement and said, Labor, without clique or faction, believes that Ford and Sir were unjustly convicted and as a unit demands their release. Anita Whitney, social worker and suffragist, speaking for the California YWCA and other women's clubs, told the governor, a nation is valued by the ability of the people to organize. That is what Ford and Sir were doing at the time of their arrest, trying to organize their own people for their own protection and interests. They should not be made to pay the penalty for the introduction of an armed force for which they were not responsible. At the conclusion of the hearing, Governor Johnson announced that he would study the record of the trial with extreme care, and if he found the men innocent they would be freed. If guilty, they will remain where they are. 47. The A.F. of L unions throughout California suspended activities in behalf of the imprisoned men until the governor handed down his decision. Not so, however, the WW. The Wobblies had little confidence that Ford and Sir's release could be achieved by relying on Johnson's impartial study of the record. They were convinced that so far as WW members were concerned, THTE governor, hating the organization as he did, was anything but impartial. Direct action on the job was worth more than appeals to Governor Johnson. 48. The 1915 campaign. In the summer of 1915, while Johnson was considering the pardon appeal, the WW initiated a new direct action campaign. But, unlike 1914, This did not involve a picket line of the hop fields. As Charles L. Lambert, WW organizer in Sacramento, explained to Ford, the picket line was far too defensive to keep up, too dangerous on account of the gunmen, hired by the ranchers, and too unwieldy to handle. Instead, the Wobblies would depend on their own individual action to make every kick count. 49 The 1915 campaign for Ford and Sir took the form of a boycott against California hop fields, canneries and their products, publicized through hundreds of thousands of stickers distributed in California, the eastern states, and as far away as Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. These stickers, printed in red ink, announced that the boycott was on and would continue until Ford and Sir were free. Called upon Hay Hands to demand $2 or more on board for IO hours or less, and urged, "Don't forget Ford and Sir on the job. As long as Ford and Sir are in prison, don't stick copper nails or tacks in fruit trees or grape vines. It hurts them." This admonition was distributed only in the state of California. The IWW explained that, being solicitous of the welfare of our master's property, it was simply trying to prevent hotheads from resorting to sabotage to free Ford and Sir. But it did not expect its warning to be heeded by all. There are still among the working class those to whom one can tell nothing. 50. During the summer of 1915, California newspapers were filled with reports of fires in the hop fields, all, according to the papers, set by the Wobblies. "Trail of fire follows Ford and Sir," read the headline in the San Francisco Examiner of September 2. On June 10, 1915, Lambert wrote to Bill Haywood from Sacramento, "The wheat fields are on fire about 50 miles from here. Damage so far is about $250,000. Officially, however, the IWW either labeled the fires mysterious or pointed out that numerous fires occur in all parts of the country at all times. Apparent ly only those taking place in California are being recorded in the newspapers and laid at the door of the LWW. But there is no doubt that in fighting the California farmers and fruit growers, the IWW was using direct action. As Lambert explained, the fact that we spread stickers all over the country and raise our voices on the street corners in protest will not help matters much. It will take action on the job, and vigorous action at that, to get these boys out." Yet he conceded that while many Wobblies were ready to plaster the state with stickers and start strikes, they were not so eager to resort to sabotage. "The whole trouble is that there are not enough men willing to make the cat effective to any extent." 51. For all the reports of sabotage in the press, there was no concrete evidence of IWW responsibility for any act of destruction. In 1915, the California Commission on Immigration and Housing charged that the LWW was preaching all kinds of lawlessness such as arson, sabotage, and assassination. But after 2 years of intense investigation, the commission had been unable to unearth an indictable offense under California law. During the Chicago trial of 165 leaders and members of the LWW in 191 J18, Horace Thorwalder, the sheriff of Fresno County, California, was called to the witness stand. He told of many fires in his county following the trial of Ford and Sir, but when asked if the members of the LWW set the fires, he replied, "I never said they did. I don't know who did it." The most sensational evidence in the trial were the letters of C. L. Lambert as secretary of the Ford and Sir Defense Committee. Lambert's boast, in a letter to St. John, that the reduced hop crop in California was the result of WW sabotage, was cited by the prosecution as proof that the WW had both preached and practiced violence and sabotage. In his testimony at the trials, Lambert commented on his letters as follows: "With regard to the suggestion by my counsel that it was just a bluff, with regarding to driving copper nails in trees, and things of that kind, I will say that there has been no case produced here, and there was nothing of it done. I will say that it was just bluff, greater than Lee too." This testimony is in keeping with Lambert's revelation in the Industrial Worker of May R. 1917, that only threats of sabotage had been employed up to that time to free Ford and Sir. On September 11, 1915, after 7 months of study of the case, Governor Johnson handed down his decision in the pardon appeal. He described the conviction of Ford and Sir in such a way as to indicate that they were innocent. By a forced construction of the law of conspiracy of an industrial revolt, those who had committed no wrong themselves were convicted of a heinous offense. He went on to admit that a survey of the entire case, while not authorizing a pardon, would justify a mitigation of the sentences imposed. Then, in a bitter attack upon the LWW campaign to free the 2 men, he declared, "But so long as in behalf of these men the threats of injury and sabotage continue, so long as incendiarism is attempted, I will neither listen to appeals for clemency on behalf of Ford and Sir, nor in any fashion consider the shortening of their terms of imprisonment." He concluded by advising the AFL unions in California to dissociate themselves from the defense campaign, warning them that they were only creating publicity for the IWW. R.A. The Alameda Building Trades, in its protest to Johnson, one of many sent by labor bodies in California, accused the governor of a major inconsistency. You admit that Ford and Sir could not have had any part in the alleged campaign of violence, and yet they are to be punished as long as threats of injury and sabotage continue. Tom Mooney, Secretary-Treasurer of the International Workers' Defense League, warned the AFL unions not to fall for Johnson's attempt to win their favor, and urged them to unite with the LWW in continuing the campaign to free the imprisoned men. The workers must act, and they will act until Ford and Sir walk out free men vindicated to the labor world as their champion in the greatest cause in history, greater than. Mooney's concluding words sent a chill through the California ranch bosses. While they hailed Johnson's refusal to pardon Ford and Sir, they were far from satisfied in view of the threat of a renewal of the direct action campaign to free the prisoners. Durst and his associates had created their own police force of private gunmen and detectives as a protection against the LWW at a cost of over $10,000 a year for individual growers. By the end of 191s, they were complaining that they were still unable to do business effectively with such a menace as the LWW hovering over our heads day and night, and that it was not going to be an easy matter to rid the coast of these operators. Through the Farmers' Protective League, they appealed to the U.S. government to eliminate the LWW by federal prosecution. The appeal was endorsed by the governors of California, Oregon, Washington, and Utah who, led by Governor Johnson, charged an interstate conspiracy by the Wobblies to create abnormal disorder and incendiarism, and urged the Wilson administration to investigate the LWW immediately for possible federal prosecution. 15. President Wilson, prodded by his Secretary of the Interior, Franklin K. Lane, authorized the inquiry. The Department of Justice dispatched a special agent to uncover the interstate conspiracy and prosecute the LWW leaders. The Federals sought information from the California Commission on Immigration and Housing only to be told by Simon J. Lubin, its chairman, "We are not in a position, we regret to say, to point out to you definitely any violations of federal law." The special agent's own investigation corroborated this statement, for he was unable to discover any violations of the nation's criminal laws. The agent placed the LWW membership in California and Washington at 4 feet 000, chiefly panhandlers, without homes, mostly foreigners, the discontented and unemployed, who are not anxious to work. He thus revealed his ignorance of the influence exerted by the LWW among the migratory workers. Its speakers abused the existing government, but never talked dynamiting, only sabotage. The fires in California were caused by individual members and are not believed to be instigated by the Home Office. The large number of tramps frequenting California in winter gives good material for speakers to work on. 116. Following this report, the Justice Department concluded that it will not be possible to develop violations of the federal criminal laws by these people, unless by the use of the mails. Asterisk anticipating this finding. The reference was to threatening letters sent to Governor Johnson warning that, if you don't turn these men free by November 1st, then after that date you can look for trouble. Some of these KTTERS are unprintable, but since they were anonymous and usually signed, yours, WW, it was impossible to track down the senders. A number of these letters are in the Department of Justice file, 150,139/47, NA. Hatred of Governor Johnson was so intense among IWW members that a private state investigator, who worked inside the WW, reported, after a discussion with 3 California Wobbly leaders, one of whom was Charles L. Lambert, the men seemed to be more bitter towards the governor than any of the private interests of the state. E. Clemens Horst investigation. Report of Thomas McGowan covering period from October 30th to November 4th, 1915, Hiram W. John S. R. Papers, University of California, Berkeley. Lubin had proposed that our national laws should be modified. 57. After the United States entered the World War, Lubin's suggestion was adopted and the Espionage and Selective Service laws gave the Department of Justice the power to prosecute and outlaw the WW, which it did not yet possess in 1915158. By 1917, the IWW estimated that the convictions of Ford and Sir had cost the California farmers $10 million a year, while the authorities themselves set the total figure at $15 to $20 million since 1914.59. Meanwhile, Ford and Sir remained in Folsom Prison. On April 29, 1916, the industrial worker published a letter from Ford which contained this advice: "It is better to be locked up for life than to be a miserable Mr. Block, indifferent to your class, but willing, so damned willing to receive the benefits of the struggles of the others. So I say, you working men and women, get together now, in one big union, for better pay, shorter hours, better surroundings." What the Wheatland affair accomplished. It was not until 1925 and 1926 that Ford and Sir were finally released from prison. While the agitation of the IWW to secure their immediate release was not successful, it had the effect, along with the general publicity given the Wheatland affair, of producing legislation to improve living and housing conditions for migratory workers. In the report of the Commission on Immigration and Housing, which had investigated the Wheatland riot and its aftermath, Drive. Carlton Parker wrote, "The employers must be shown that it is essential that living conditions among their employees be improved not only in the fulfillment of their obligations to society in general, but also to protect and promote their own welfare." Of course, the ranchers, as we have seen, were convinced that their own welfare would be best promoted by their private gunmen and by federal action outlawing the WW. But despite their opposition, legislation was passed to improve conditions for the migratory workers. In appealing to these workers to keep up the campaign to free Ford and Sir, the Wheatland Defense Committee asked in April 1916, "Have you noticed how much better are the conditions in the hop fields and other agricultural jobs since that eventful Sunday in August 1913? Did you ever stop to think that Ford and Sir, because of their efforts to organize the slaves on Durst's hop fields, are paying their..." Ford applied for a parole which was granted on September 2, 1925. But as he left Folsom Prison, he was rearrested for the murder of Deputy Sheriff Eugene Reardon during the Wheatland affair. He was tried in January 1926 and acquitted. Sir was released on parole on October 26, 1926. See Industrial Work tilde. November 28, December 19, 1925, January 2, 16, 23, 30, 1926. Industrial Peon tilde. March, 1926. The Story of the Ford Case, American Civil Liberties Union pamphlet, December 1925. Liberty for the benefits you are now receiving. Among these benefits, the committee cited that water was being brought to workers in the fields free of charge and that the state commission had the police power to force the cleaning up of camps, not only in the hop fields but on construction jobs as well. 60. Another result of the Wheatland affair was an increase in WW prestige and membership due to its championing of the most oppressed section of the California working class and the publicity it received during the trial and the struggle to free Ford and Sir. President Wilson's Federal Commission on Western Labor reported that in March 1914, the IWW in California had 40 locals, 5 full-time paid organizers, and several hundred part-time organizers, soapboxers, who supported themselves through the sale of literature. The membership in the state was estimated at 5,000. Unheard of 8 years ago in this state, complained a California labor paper in August 1914, the number of individuals now professing the lawless doctrines of this lawless association has increased sufficiently to prompt the hop growers to ask protection from county authorities. 61. Respect for the WW had grown among AF of members as a result of the struggle to improve the unspeakable conditions of migratory workers. Paul Brissenden, in his report to the Department of Labor, August 1914, wrote, "The IWW doctrine docs not now meet with the indifference among the conservative working men that it did but a few years ago." Said one member, 3 years ago I had a hard time to get those scissor bill working stiffs to even listen to the IWW dope. Now it's easy. They come around and ask for it. The dope was influencing the AF of L in California. Though, compared with the AF of L, John D. Barry noted in the San Francisco Bulletin, the IWW seems almost insignificant. It is exerting a powerful influence on the older and larger organization. Already its ideas have quickened the AF of L and started it into greater activity. 62. Due to the industrial depression of 1913-15, which hit the West Coast especially hard and put 75% of IWW members in this region out of work, 63. The gain in the organization's membership did not prove to be permanent. But several things of permanent value did emerge from the Wheatland affair. For one thing, it brought into the forefront the entire problem of migratory labor, and opened in this respect, as Dr. Carlton Parker noted, a new and momentous labor epoch. Then again, it made the IWW the militant spokesman for the agricultural workers. George Speed, testifying before the Commission on Industrial Relations in 1915, pointed out correctly that the sentiment of the great number of migratory workers is strongly with the IWW. Greater than 6 feet whatever sentiment existed among these workers' tour organization during the next decade was to be expressed through the IWW. Before turning to a study of the IWW in the eastern industrial sections of the country, let us summarize what the organization accomplished in the Pacific Northwest, the South, and California during the period 1909 to 1915. It developed and tested its tactics in organizing the workers in the lumber, construction, and agricultural industries, the vast majority of whom were migratory. It discarded those tactics which proved ineffective, and began, towards the end of this period, to develop new and more effective methods which were to bear fruit in the next period. While the results of these years of activity did not loom large in terms of the size, strength, and permanency of the unions established in these industries, they left an imprint which could not be erased. The free speech fights and strikes associated with the IWW's drive to better the living conditions of these exploited workers, neglected by the AF, and the solidarity established during these struggles among men and women of different races, religions, and nationalities did produce some improvements in living conditions and laid the foundation for still others to come later. Surveying the work of the 1WW among the Western migratory workers in the period from 1909 to 1915, a writer in Sunset magazine for February 1917 concluded, dismal unsanitary bunkhouses, poor food, unscreened eating houses swarming with flies, bunks enlivened by vermin, grafting foremen and the total lack of opportunity for wholesome recreation were the principal factors which caused men to listen respectfully to IWW orators. In the Western states, the menace of the IWW caused far-sighted employers to look at their laborers with different eyes, to provide better living conditions. These far-sighted employers cleaned and spruced their camps, provided better food, established reading rooms and camp YMCA branches, not as charity, but because it paid. And the stubborn, bull-headed employers, still befogged by ancient habits of thought, were forced by law to make their camps sanitary. Reprinting this statement, the industrial worker noted that there were still many improvements to be made in the conditions of these workers. But it added that, if that were the sum total of our several years' work, the organization would still justify its existence. S. Chapter 12. Organizing the Home Guard in Steel. The leading article in the first issue of Solidarity, December 18, 1909, opened with the sentence, "The event of prime significance in the industrial history of America during the past year was the McKees Rocks strike. Since this was the year that saw the uprising of the 20,000, the general strike of the shirtwaist makers of New York, the statement was dismissed in some circles as an example of boasting by the IWW, which had played an important role at McKees Rocks. But without in the least detracting from the significance of the other great struggle of 1909 greater than the strike against the Pressed Steel Car Company, A.U.S. Steel subsidiary, merits the place assigned to it in Solidarity. It was the first important demonstration of the fallacy of the widespread dual theory that immigrant workers were too downtrodden to resist oppression and too lacking in ability, experience, and unity to organize effectively along industrial lines. The McKees Rocks strike was important in still another sense. It marked the first victory against the Steel Trust since the disastrous defeat of 1901. In 1904 feet 1905-119 Q6, 1907, and 1908, U.S. Steel had delivered blow after blow against the organized steel workers, reducing the membership of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers from 6,000 in 1901, when the trust was organized, to 8,000 in 1908, when it shut down the last union plant of the National Tube Company to starve the strikers out, and transferred the work to its non-union plants. By the beginning of 1909, it appeared that J.P. Morgan had kept his word when he had promised 4 years before to drive unionism out of every plant in the gigantic steel trust. The figures spoke for themselves: 118,000 workers and 8,000 union men in these plants, the latter primarily the skilled workmen. 1. This strike will be discussed in Volume V. History of the Labor Movement in the United States. The McKees Rocks strike.
Then in July 1909, a strike broke out among the unorganized workers at the Pressed Steel Car Company in McKees Rocks, PA, located 6 miles below
Pittsburgh, which reversed the tragic trend. The company fabricated railway and steel railway cars on an assembly line basis, employing mainly foreign-born workers. A deliberate policy of splitting up the working force into various nationality and language groups was followed with the expectation that this would prevent the workers from acting in a unified manner. In 1909, there were 16 different nationalities among the 5,000 workers employed at the plants: Americans, Germans, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Slovaks, Croatians, Poles, Turks, Lithuanians, Russians, Greeks, Italians, Armenians, Romanians, Bulgarians, and Swiss. Of these, the largest nationality group were the Hungarians, the Hunkies, as they were derisively called, who were regarded by both the corporation owners and the leaders of the craft unions as the least intelligent, the least independent, the least Americanized workers, and the most content to be driven like slaves. 2. The Americans were the skilled workers, riveters and axle turners, and a very small percentage of the workers in the plants. Most of the others were semi-skilled and unskilled, and could be trained on the job within a few days after being hired. The company heaped abuse after abuse upon the workers, operating on the theory that a working force, composed largely of recent arrivals in the country who were without money or friends and were unable to speak the language of the country or of many of the other workers in the plants, was in a helpless condition. The men were forced to work in pools. According to this system, men with specific ratings, such as riveters, heaters, or helpers, were lumped into gangs, and their earnings made dependent upon the gross output of the gang. There were 52 pools, ranging from 10 men to 150 each. There was no fixed wage, but at the end of the completion of a car, the company announced the sum that had been set aside for each gang. If, due to the foreman's error or to a mistake of a gangmate, the car was not completed, the whole gang went unpaid. Moreover, 25 to 40 cents per hour to pay the wages of the foreman was taken out of the pool formed for the workmen's wages. Since the company refused to post the rates, the men had no idea of what money was due them at the end of each week. 3. Under the gang system, skilled workmen labored from 1 a.m. to I.30. This underscore was a special hardship for the immigrants. The foreigners, a Pittsburgh paper pointed out, labor under men speaking a strange tongue. The pooling and intricate pay system of the strangers are beyond the comprehension of the foreign-bound toilers. Pittsburgh Leader, July 15, 1909. p.m. 6 days a week at a rate of less than $1 a day. Affidavits submitted by the workers in the form of paychecks showed earnings for unskilled men of $1 for 3 days' work, $15 for 14 days, and for riveters, $14.50 for 10 ease days. 2. A track or belt system used in the construction of the cars was continually being speeded up. The gang system, of course, drove the workers to the very limit of their endurance, since the fastest worker set the pace for the entire gang. 3. A vicious system of extortion existed in the plants. Workers had to pay superintendents and foremen to get a job, and then had to pay to keep the job. The fee ranged from $5 to $1 for a job at the plant. Even then there was no certainty of holding the job. Many workers were discharged after a few weeks, and others hired to obtain the entrance fee. Those who were fired could get their jobs back by paying the fee. Thus men were constantly being hired, fired, and rehired simply to extort payments from them. It was estimated that company officials extorted $10,000 a month from the workers in graft fees. Evidence existed also of wives and daughters of the workers being forced to submit to the company's agents in the knowledge that unless they did so their relatives would be discharged. 11. 4. A horrifying disregard of the life and limb of the workers resulted in a tremendously high rate of fatal accidents. One of the plants was known as the slaughterhouse, because so many men were killed there, and another as the last chance, for it was said that, if a man ever worked in this mill he has no chance on earth outside. According to Joseph Armstrong, formerly coroner of Pittsburgh, who had investigated conditions at the plant during his tenure in office, the Pressed Steel Car Company killed an average of 1 man a day at its works because of the speed-up system and the failure to protect machinery. 6. 5. Although the Pennsylvania state law prohibited company stores, the company got around this by forcing the workers to trade at stores it owned through agents. Those who purchased goods elsewhere were discharged. Prices at the company's stores were much higher than at privately owned stores in the community. 6. Under the name of the Fidelity Land Company, the Pressed Steel Car Co. owned 200 double houses for the rental of which it charged exorbitant rents minus $12 a month for 4 rooms with no water or toilet facilities in them. This was deducted from the workers' pay. A Pittsburgh reporter described the shacks. I spent several hours in the dwelling places for they cannot be called homes of these workingmen yesterday, July 14, 1909. They are all alike, both without and within. Children and parents live in dingy 2-story frame houses which, jammed close together in the long rows which line the yellow clay of the street, cause one to think of abandoned pest houses in a region which has been swept by virulent disease. These houses have 4 stalls, described by the company officials as rooms. They rent for $12 a month. Workingmen are not forced to live in them, but for some inexplicable reason those who dwell elsewhere do not remain long in the employ of the company. 7. President Frank N. Hofstad of the Pressed Steel Car Company dismissed the notion that $12 for a 4-room shack without facilities was exorbitant. As every family has a number of roomers, the rent does not amount to much. He did not add that, as established by affidavits of the workers, the company forced the occupants of its houses to pay a percentage of the rent received from boarders. 8. The Pittsburgh Leader angrily denounced the Pressed Steel Car Works as the most outrageous of all the industrial plants in the United States, and it is not on record that the most industrially degraded sections of degraded Europe has its like. Reverend Father A. F. Foner, pastor of St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church at McKees Rocks, made an on-the-spot investigation of the plants prior to the outbreak of the strike. In a public statement, he corroborated the leader's indictment of the company. Men are persecuted, robbed and slaughtered, and their wives are abused in a manner worse than death all to obtain or retain positions that barely keep starvation from the door. It is a pit of infamy where men are driven lower than the degradation of slaves and compelled to sacrifice their wives and daughters to the villainous foremen and lil bosses to be allowed to work. It is a disgrace to a civilized country. A man is given less consideration than a dog, and dead bodies are simply kicked aside while the men are literally driven to their death. Greater than in. To all this President Hofstad had but one reply: if a man is dissatisfied, it is his privilege to quit. 10. The strike at the pressed steel car works thus grew out of long-standing grievances. But it was precipitated by the refusal of the company to restore wage cuts made during the panic of HJ07. Although the workers had been assured that the reductions would only be temporary, the wages, instead of being restored to pre-panic levels, were cut still further, and beginning early in 1909 reductions were made almost weekly. Workers who earned $3, $4 and $5 a day in 1907 were actually taking home 50 cents, 75 cents and $1 a day in 190_9, or an average of 12 cents an hour for the same work. When reminded that the company had assured the workers that the reductions after 1907 were only to be temporary, President Hofstad remarked coldly, "We buy labor in the cheapest market." 11. The cheapest market, of course, was Castle Garden, where the immigrants landed from Europe. On Saturday, July 10, 1909, the men were paid as usual. On Monday, there were many complaints by the workers to timekeepers and foremen that they had no way of telling from their pay envelopes what they had actually earned. Many also complained that the long-promised restoration of wages had once again failed to materialize. But 40 riveters at the Last Chance plant did more than complain. They refused to work unless they were told their rate of pay and guaranteed the rescinding of the wage cuts. When they returned on Tuesday, July 3, they were discharged. The same day, 60 men in the erection department were out with the same demands. Men from the shearing and pressing departments followed them. Now 60 men were on strike. In a petition to the Company, they presented their demand for the abolition of the pooling system and a return to the 1/07 rate. But the management refused an audience to the committee presenting the petition. Word of the company's action spread rapidly to the various departments. On July 14, all the men in the plant, except 500 in the wooden works and a small group of union electricians, stopped work. 5,000 men were out. Without organization, without knowing how many would strike, without funds, they quit, wrote a reporter. 12. Although taken by surprise, the company swung immediately into action to break the strike. A call was sent to the local police for assistance and then to Pittsburgh and Cleveland for strikebreakers. The local chief of police hurried to the yards and attempted to arrest a striker, hoping this would frighten the rest of the men. He was set upon by 50 strikers, severely beaten, and driven off. The battle now shifted to the banks of the Ohio River. Learning that the steamer, Steel Queen, owned by the company, was attempting to land strikebreakers in the mills by way of the water gates leading from the river, 300 strikers, armed with rifles, rushed to the river bank. As the steamer attempted to land the strikebreakers, the strikers let loose a round of shots. The strikebreakers and the boat crew, armed in advance, returned the fire. After 100 shots were exchanged, without causing any casualty, the Steel Queen turned and made for the opposite shore where the scabs were disembarked. The strikers had won the Battle of the Ohio. 17 years before, less only 1 week, the steel strikers at Homestead had repulsed a similar attempt to land the hated Pinkertons from barges in the famous Battle of the Monongahela. What followed on July 15 also brought back memories of Homestead, where the Carnegie Iron and Steel Company had had the help of the local police force, armed deputies, and National Guardsmen to break the strike. By the morning of July 15, 300 deputy sheriffs, armed with rifles, and aided by 200 state constables, including 62 mounted troopers, the hated Cossacks, surrounded the plant at McKee's Rocks. Rioting started when 50 mounted constables tried to evict families of the strikers from the company houses. Since the workers had no leases on their dwellings, they could be evicted at any time by the company. The wives of the strikers, threatening to burn the company houses, fought back, and shouted to their husbands, "Kill the Cossacks. Crush them. Stamp them out. If you are afraid, go home to the children and leave the work to us." The mounted troops charged the strikers and their wives, riding them down. The workers replied with rocks and missiles, whereupon the troopers fired volleys into the crowd, first of blank cartridges and then of real bullets. Nearly 100 strikers and sympathizers were injured. 25 strikers were arrested and charged with inciting a riot. But the evictions were stopped. As one reporter wrote, "The strikers have announced that any attempt to oust their families from their houses in the company row will be fought to a finish, and more violence is sure to follow if this is attempted." 14. Meeting that same evening at historic Indian Mound, a mile from the works, on a ridge of ground overlooking the Ohio River, the strikers elected a committee of 10, representing as many nationalities, to present the workers' grievances to the company officials in Pittsburgh and offer arbitration. The committee came to Pittsburgh on July 16 with signed credentials proving that they were bona fide representatives of all the strikers. But President Hofstad refused even to see them. "There is no strike," he declared. The plant would continue to operate. The strikers then had their photographs taken, 5,000 strong, to prove there was a strike. But this meant nothing to the company. Hofstad announced that the management not only would not negotiate with the strikers, but that they would never be allowed to work again for the company. "They're dead to us. There are more than enough idle men in Pittsburgh to fill every vacancy." 16. This arrogant refusal to arbitrate caused the Pittsburgh leader to ask, "Who is this Hofstad who assumes the power of a czar? Does he not know that he is in America, and not in Russia?" 16. The immediate effect of Hofstad's arrogance was to drive the strikers to organize the struggle more effectively. At first, the American and foreign-born workers operated separately, each through a committee. But when it became clear that the company was girding for a long battle, it was decided to amalgamate both groups. A committee known as the Big Six, composed of representatives of the American and foreign-born strikers, was elected, headed by C.A. Wise, an American-born worker in the axle department. The Big Six was empowered to meet with management for negotiations. When it was ready to sit down with the committee, arrange mass meet, several months later, the newspaper was in a better position to answer the question as to who Hofstad was. The president of the Pressed Steel Car Company was indicted for bribery in the Pittsburgh graft cases and was arrested as a fugitive from justice. New York Call, April 8, 21, 1910. Ings, run the commissary and preserve order. Since most of the members of the committee were inexperienced in strike strategy, the group sought help from the Socialist Party in Pittsburgh, which assigned a party lawyer to help the group obtain a settlement of the strike. 17. The unity of the skilled and unskilled, American and foreign-born workers thus far was indeed remarkable. Before the strike, the American workers had never mingled with the hunkies, but as C.A. Wise put it, after the strike started, "They have got the whole of us to fight now. We are trying to be men among men." To prove this point, 50 union electricians of the Westinghouse Electric Company doing erecting work at the Pressed Steel Car Plant left their jobs on July 16 in sympathy with the strikers. 18. Nevertheless, there was an important difference in the attitudes as to how the strike should be conducted between the skilled American and the unskilled, foreign-born workers. Some of the skilled workers, such as the repairmen and electricians, were not affected by the pooling system. Yet they had a higher degree of representation on the Big Six than those who worked under this system. C.A. Wise, chairman of the Big Six, worked in a department which was not affected by the pool. None of the skilled workers lived in the company shacks, and few of them were required to pay graft to obtain and hold their jobs. Furthermore, the Americans had less to fear from the Cossacks than did the foreign-born workers, who were held in contempt by the constabulary and were always the special targets in attacks upon the strikers. For all these reasons, the skilled American workers and their spokesmen were more eager to seek a compromise settlement early in the strike, which would omit many of the most pressing grievances of the foreign-born strikers. They urged the men to be patient, favored placing stress on appeals to civic bodies to intervene with management in behalf of the strikers, and made no plans for a prolonged struggle. 19. A group of the foreign-born strikers, however, had had experience in revolutionary and labor struggles in Europe. They realized early in the strike that only a vigorous, militant strategy would achieve victory. This group elected a committee among themselves which became known as the Unknown Committee, composed of men who had had strike and revolutionary experience in Russia, England, France, Austria, Poland, Germany, Italy, etc. This committee quietly took charge of the strike, planned the tactics of the battle, and put into operation methods of strike. According to one contemporary reporter, many of the Hungarians on the committee had participated in the Great Railway Strike in Hungary. The Russians had taken part in the Bloody Sunday massacre at St. Petersburg. The Swiss had participated in the railroad strike in Switzerland, the Italians in the resistance movement of Italy, and the Germans had been members of the Metallarbeiter Verein, Metalworkers Industrial Union, of Germany. Louis Duché, Victory at McKees Rock, International Socialist Review, Volume X, October 1909, pp. 295-96. Strategy which, though used often in Europe, were new to the American labor movement and were to influence the conduct of strikes among the foreign-born workers for many years to come. Among the McKees Rock strikers, the committee was known as the Kerntruppen, a term derived from the military system of Germany, where it referred to a choice group of fearless and trained men who may be trusted on any occasion. LL0. Although the IWW-4 did not openly enter the strike until mid-August, it was to that organization that the Unknown Committee, 3 of whose members were Wobblies when the strike started, turned early in the struggle for advice and direction. After discussions with IWW leaders in Newcastle, PA, where, as we shall see, the WW Union Number 208 was playing an active role in the strike of the tin workers against the American Sheet and Tin Plate Company, the Unknown Committee established a 24-hour picket system, a signal and watch system to notify the strikers of any attempts to introduce strikebreakers, and committees of pickets to stop every streetcar entering the town and every ferry boat entering the area, compel the passengers to account for themselves, and take off anyone who might be a strikebreaker. It also organized speakers for each of the 16 nationalities among the strikers to address mass meetings, arranged by nationality, at which emphasis was placed upon the importance of uniting all workers along industrial lines which would eliminate caste, language, and nationality barriers. Thus early in the struggle, due to the work of the unknown committee, the McKees Rocks strikers displayed an intelligence, discipline, and solidarity which amazed veteran reporters who had come to the city expecting to find a confused rabble. 21. It was certainly not a confused rabble which issued a moving statement of grievances on July 18, in which they presented evidence of paychecks of 9 less than greater than cents for 45 hours work and others disclosing payments ranging from a low of 2 cents to a high of 0 cents an hour. Is it possible to live on such wages in a decent manner and provide for a family? The statement asked, and concluded, "We shall fight to a finish, as it is our right. We beg all the working men and citizens to help us in our victory. Help the workers in this struggle, for this is a fight not only for ourselves, but also to save our wives and children from starvation." 22. The appeal brought an immediate response. The District Council of the Carpenters and Joiners in Pittsburgh announced its support of the strikers, stating, "We sympathize with these poor men and their wives and children, whose condition is worse than that of the African slave." On July 24, 20 wagon loads of bread and meat, supplied by trade unionists and sympathetic merchants of Pittsburgh, arrived at the strikers' commissary, which was now supplying more than 3,000 families with food. 23. Louis Dukes lists these men as Ignaz Klavier, Polish, Henigli, Hungarian, and Max Foraker, German. Dukes, Op. Cit. Page 295. Evidently this growing public support frightened the local authorities, for on July 26, the sheriff prohibited bringing in strikebreakers. Mass picketing continued, however, and the plants remained closed. On July 27, C.A. Wise, speaking for the Big Six Committee, announced that by the 30th, the strike would be settled on the basis of the pre-panic of 1907 scale of wages. For the next 3 days, the press carried reports under the headlines, "Strikers Optimistic, McKees Rocks Workers Feel Sure That Company Will Yield, Pressed Steel Car Company Mert Give In." 24. But the unknown committee was under no such illusions. It knew that the company was sending agents to New York and Cleveland to recruit scabs, that the sheriff would yield to company pressure and permit them to be brought into the plants, that the constabulary were still beating up strikers, and that a plan was being hatched to evict all the company's tenants. The optimistic reports of the chairman of the Big Six indicated simply that there were elements among the strikers, a group of skilled workers in particular, that favored compromise and surrender. 25. Events justified the unknown committee's evaluation of the situation. On August 6, the company denied all reports that it would institute a new wage policy, and secured a writ to evict 47 company tenants. The following day, battles broke out again between the constabulary and the strikers as the former attempted to evict the workers and their families. The next day, another battle was fought to prevent the constabulary from escorting strikebreakers into the plants. On August 2, Steve Howitt, a striker, was killed by the constabulary as he tried to halt the scabs. 5,000 were in the funeral procession, with other thousands along the line, and representatives of 16 nationalities paid their respects to the victim of the Cossacks. 26. From this point on, the unknown committee completely replaced the Big Six and took over total leadership of the strike. The committee let the constables know that for every man you kill of us, we will kill one of you. 27. The soldiers and the police became more careful. On August 15, the strikers prevented another steamer, P.M. File, from landing scabs with a volley of rifle shots from the shore. That same day, the strikers, at a mass meeting, called by the unknown committee, resolved that they would not return to work until the pooling system was abolished and all of their other grievances settled. 28. On August 15, the IWW openly entered the strike. Huge posters appeared in McKees Rocks on that day, printed in 5 languages, advertising that W.E. Troutman, IWW general organizer, would address a mass meeting on Indian Mound on August 17. 8,000 attended the meeting, most of them strikers and trade unionists from Pittsburgh. Troutman, who came to McKees Rocks with B.H. Williams and Charles McSver, IWW organizers at Newcastle who had been advising the unknown committee, addressed the meeting in English and German while others translated his address into Polish, Hungarian, Croatian and Romanian. He called the strike one of the most important in labor history and predicted success if it was organized properly. After his speech, the audience was divided into different nationalities, and speakers in the language of each group addressed them on the need to organize into an industrial union. 29. On August 20th, at another mass meeting, the Car Builders Industrial Union, IWW, was organized. 3,000 strikers immediately signed up and issued a manifesto in which they announced that they would never again return to work unorganized and unprotected. Inspired by the great principles of class solidarity, they have organized industrially, all of one plant or industry into one powerful union, irrespective of craft, sex, creed, color or nationality. 30. Up to this time, the McKees Rocks strike had not aroused too much interest outside of Pennsylvania. Then, during the week of August 22, the picture changed, and the labor and socialist press throughout the country carried headlines like, "Bloody Sunday at McKees Rocks. Worse than in Russia." 31 On Sunday, August 22, a squad of strikers had boarded a streetcar entering the strike zone in search of scabs. Harry Exler, a deputy sheriff notorious for strikebreaking, was ordered to leave the car. He denounced the strikers in vile language, pulled a gun and fired at the strikers. In the battle that followed, Exler was killed. A company of state troopers rushed in and fired at the retreating strikers. In the battle between the strikers and their wives against the Cossacks, 2 lives were lost, 8 strikers and sympathizers, 2 scabs and 1 mounted trooper. 40 strikers were wounded and many were arrested, including the wounded, who were dragged off to jail with the blood streaming from their wounds. Others were manacled to the troopers' horses and dragged through the streets. On the following day, the troopers stormed through Hunkyville, the name of the community where most of the company houses were located, and attacked men and women in the shacks, driving them out of their homes. All strike meetings were raided and strikers dispersed. 32. The 2-day Holocaust produced an outburst of indignation from the labor and socialist press. Street Louis Labor cried out furiously. When future historians compare the present labor wars of America with those of Russia, they will conclude that in the murderous treatment of the working class, Uncle Sam and his capitalist plutocracy were far ahead of the Muscovite rulers in northeastern Europe and Siberia. Even the conservative press was angered by the company announcement that it was not concerned with what measures were used against the strikers since they were no longer its employees. Treasurer and, in the absence of Gompers in Europe, the leading spokesman for the Federation. He blamed the trouble at McKees Rocks on the introduction of ignorant foreign labor, aliens who do not speak our language and understand our institutions, and he went to great pains to let it be known that the strikers were in no way connected with the AF, which should, therefore, not be held responsible for the violence that featured the strike. Morrison did not add that the AF had never concerned itself with the needs and problems of the workers at the Pressed Steel Car Co. 83. Meanwhile, the strikers had regrouped their ranks and determined to hold meetings despite the troopers' threat to disperse all gatherings. A mass meeting was scheduled at Indian Mound on August 25 and Eugene V. Debs, the socialist leader, was invited to be the principal speaker. Debs accepted immediately, and then in a public statement announced that he had been threatened with bodily harm if he came to McKees Rocks. "I will be there to make an address if I am alive. No Pennsylvania troopers will prevent me from addressing those men." Debs came to McKees Rocks on schedule. He saw the streets dotted with families trudging along with baby buggies in which were the children, bedding and other household furnishings. These refugees were the strikers who had been evicted from the company houses. 3 feet. Later that day, 10,000 strikers and sympathizers heard Debs speak at Indian Mound. The socialist leader called the strike the greatest labor fight in all my history in the labor movement, and predicted that it would not only end in victory for the workers, but serve as a harbinger of a new spirit among the unorganized, foreign-born workers in the mass production industries who can see here in McKees Rocks the road on which they must travel, the road of industrial unionism. Referring to Morrison's effort to disassociate the AF from the violence of the strikers, he declared that the violence had not been caused by the workers but by the corporations and their minions who were hired to assassinate workmen. 311. Debs' prediction of victory for the strikers was justified by the facts. The company was not making the slightest headway in breaking the solidarity of the strikers. The evicted families were as determined to continue the struggle as those who still lived at home. Indeed, the children of all the strikers agreed not to attend school until victory. So effective was the picket patrol of the streetcars that the Pittsburgh Street Railway Company suspended service through the strike area. The president explained that, "For some time we have been unable to protect our passengers." He could have added that, for some time, transportation workers had refused to haul strikebreakers on the street railway because of sympathy for the strikers. 36. Strikebreakers were being brought into the plants, but many kept deserting with stories of peonage in the mills. Since many of these men were Hungarians who had been recruited at Castle Garden and brought to McKees Rocks without any knowledge of the strike, their stories of being forcibly detained in the plant aroused the interest of the Austro-Hungary vice consul in Washington. He asked the United States government to investigate, and a federal investigator was sent to McKees Rocks. Actually, Austro-Hungary representatives had made a study of the strikers' grievances early in the struggle and had asked the United States Department of Commerce and Labor to investigate. But their request had been ignored. Now, however, the cry of peonage was so loud that the complaint of the Austro-Hungary vice-consul could not be buried.
The New York Call remarked bitterly on August 26, 1909, the intervention of the Austro-Hungarian representatives to this country in defense of the alien laborers at McKees Rocks, an intervention made necessary by the inactivity and torpor of our government, is calculated to mantle the cheek of every American with the blush of shame.
The effect of the government's investigation was succinctly reflected in headlines in the New York Times. On August 26, 1909, before the investigation opened, its headline read, "No peonage proof found at McKees Rocks." On August 28, the headlines were, "Steel car plant called a prison," and "Strikebreakers testify they were held in stockade against their will." The investigation, the Times concluded, had established that many of the strikebreakers had been shipped direct to McKees Rocks from immigrant vessels without realizing that they were to assume the part of strikebreakers and without understanding how they were to be paid or what perils they would encounter. Once inside the stockade, the men had been fed with rotten food, resulting in ptomaine poisoning. They had been refused their wages, and they had been forced to remain in the plants against their will. 87. The exposure of conditions at the pressed steel car plant horrified even conservative newspaper champions of the corporation. Public sympathy for the strikers mounted daily, and when the Pittsburgh Leader printed blank petitions requesting Governor Edward S. Stewart to intervene and mediate the dispute, thousands of citizens in McKees Rocks in Pittsburgh rushed to sign. The Leader also raised a fund to help feed the hungry strikers and their families, and by September 1, close to $9,000 had been collected. An additional fund was raised by the New York Volkszeitung in response to an appeal from Carbuilders Industrial Union at McKees Rocks to help more than 5,000 men and the 16,000 women and children, depending upon them, who are starving because they have become aware of the fact that they are human beings and will not allow themselves to be treated worse than cattle. 88. By the beginning of September there were definite signs that a victory for the strikers was in the offing. One was the fact, openly admitted by newspapers friendly to the company, that the attempt to operate the works with strikebreakers had failed. One of the dramatic episodes in this connection took place on August 28 when 60 strikers, mobilized by the Unknown Committee, volunteered to hire out to work in the plant in order to persuade the scabs to leave. They succeeded in bringing out 300 scabs, leaving, as the New York Sun pointed out in describing the daring feat, less than 100 workmen within the stockade. 39. Directly after this stirring victory for the strikers, the company received two major setbacks. For over 2 weeks, the Unknown Committee had been attempting to convince the trainmen of the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne and Chicago and the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroads, members of the Brotherhood of Trainmen, to refuse to haul scabs into the plant. Since these were the only railroads running into McKees Rocks, this action would effectively cut off the supply of scabs. But the history of the Brotherhood promised little hope that this action would be forthcoming. Indeed, the union's officials often rejected appeals from other railway brotherhoods on strike asking the trainmen not to work with scabs. 40. It was certainly sensational news, then, when on September X, a committee representing the Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen visited McKees Rocks and informed the strikers that the trainmen on both roads had voted unanimously not to haul any more strikebreakers for the Pressed Steel Car Co. When the crews of the two company steamers learned of the decision of the trainmen, they also sent a committee to the strikers informing them that they, too, would no longer haul scabs for the company. 41. On top of this came reports that trade unions, the labor press and socialist deputies in Austria-Hungary were warning prospective immigrants to the United States about the strike at McKees Rocks and urging them to stay away from the area. 42. The management was now defeated all along the line, and it acknowledged its defeat by entering into negotiations. A settlement was reached on September 7 which incorporated nearly all of the strikers' demands. The pool system was abolished. There was to be an immediate 5% increase in wages which was to be followed by an additional 10% within 60 days. Pay slips were to be made returnable daily. All strikebreakers were to be discharged and all the strikers rehired, including the 6 strikers who had first laid down their tools, and the members of the strike committees. A Saturday half-holiday and abolition of Sunday work except where absolutely necessary. Institution of precautions too. In his report to the 5th Convention of the IWW, November 19, R.O., Troutman praised this outstanding example of international labor solidarity and declared that it had played a vital role in the victory of the strikers. The accounts in the Austrian, Serbian and Bulgarian labor press, he emphasized, practically stopped immigration and seriously hampered the company in obtaining strikebreakers. Solidarity, November 19, 1910. Prevent accidents inside the mills. Abolition of graft among the company's agents, with any foreman caught grafting on the men to be discharged. Families were to be restored to their homes. Rentals at houses owned by the company were to be readjusted as well as prices at the company's stores, and the practice of forcing workers to deal at these stores was to be abolished. At a mass meeting at Indian Mound on the following day, the 5,000 strikers voted to accept the settlement. Thus, on September 8, after 45 days during which over 13 men had been killed and more than 500 injured, the McKees Rocks strike ended officially in a victory for the workers, and the men joyously returned to work. But first they secured 2 American flags and marched 5,000 strong, with their leaders, through the principal streets of McKees Rocks and Hunkytown. They sang victory songs, almost everything from the Marseillaise to Hail, Hail, the gang's all here. Then they marched to the C-Tilde plant to resume work. 43. The strikers had left their jobs unorganized. They returned 6½ weeks later, members of an industrial union, the Car Builders Industrial Union, a branch of the L.W.W. In a statement to the workers of America in their hour of triumph, the strikers urged them to disseminate and spread the message of industrial solidarity among those who will draw their object lessons from the McKees Rocks strike. As for themselves, with the impulse given us in this struggle, we, the workers in McKees Rocks, will do our share in the sacred duty to bring about the awakening of the hundreds of thousands suffering under such abominable bondage and exploitation. 44. The McKees Rocks strike was the major instance before the coming of the C-1.0, where unskilled steelworkers won a victory. It was one of the bloodiest battles waged in American labor history and one of the most inspiring examples of working-class solidarity ever witnessed in this country. It was a strike against the most powerful corporation in the United States, U.S. Steel, having behind it the government of Pennsylvania with its powerful, strike-breaking mounted constabulary. It was a strike which saw 5,000 unorganized men of 16 nationalities welded into a solid front which did not waver at any stage of the strike. Not a single striker scabbed, LL, and achieved a magnificent victory. The significance of the strike was immediately apparent, and it grew with the passing years. It proved that the foreign-born workers were not, as so many AF.L. leaders repeatedly insisted in excusing their failure to organize them, an ignorant, debased mass of humanity, content to work under conditions no decent human beings would tolerate. It proved that they were militant strikers, so militant, in fact, that even members of the state militia, experienced in breaking strikes, conceded that they had never seen anything to match the determination of the foreign-born strikers of McKees Rocks to achieve victory. 46. It proved that among these workers, especially among the Hungarians, Germans, Russians, Italians and Slavs, were many who had been active in the labor and revolutionary movements of Europe and had much to contribute to the American labor movement. It proved that the revolts of the exploited workers in the mass production industries need not be blind uprisings, but could be conducted along the most efficient and effective lines by the workers themselves, led by men trained in the class struggle in Europe. By recognizing these truths early in the strike, by drawing the experienced, militant elements from the ranks of the strikers, and helping them to lead the struggle, by organizing the workers into an industrial union which united skilled and unskilled, American and foreign-born, and bringing them through a magnificent struggle to victory, the W.W. played a crucial role at McKees Rocks. Its prestige soared, and it was further enhanced by Frank Morrison's frantic efforts to disassociate the AF.L. from the strike. It was obvious now to the unorganized workers in the basic industries that while the AF.L. was not concerned with their needs, the IWW was ready to help them organize and to offer advice and direction in their struggles. The Hammond strike. Make no mistake, the New York call predicted on October 9, 1909 greater than the spirit of McKees Rocks will grow. W. E. Troutman carried the spirit of McKees Rocks to East Hammond, Indiana, early in 1910 and organized Car Builders Union No. 301, L.W.W., among the workers employed at the Standard Steel Car Company, another subsidiary of U.S. Steel, which also operated plants at Butler and Newcastle, PA. Conditions were ripe for the growth of the Union. As in McKees Rocks, the workers were mainly foreign-born immigrants from 20 different lands, and here, too, the workers were forced to pay graft to the foreman to obtain and hold their jobs. Wages had been reduced by 40 to 60% since the Industrial Depression of 1907, so that many of the workers were earning as little as N cents an hour. A particular grievance was management's policy of charging rent for the company houses which had not been occupied for many months during the Depression, and deducting this from the workers' pay. 47. On January 14, 1910, a grievance committee representing the IWW Union asked the general manager for a conference. They were literally kicked out of the office, and were bluntly told that, if the Hunkies don't, Perlman and Taft maintained that the role of the IWW was a subordinate one, but this, as we have seen, is a vast underestimation. Selig Perlman and Philip Taft, History O.J. Labor in the United States, 18 cents minus 1932, New York, 1935, page 265. Like it here, they can get out. The riveters and heaters quit work as soon as the committee returned with its report, and immediately the IWW raised the slogan, "Make it an industrial union strike." Circulars, printed in 5 languages, appealed to all workers to make it a fight of all for all. The Lake County Times, the leading local newspaper, blamed the movement on the agitators who have come to Hammond from McKees Rocks, Pa, but was forced to admit regretfully that the circulars were printed by a local establishment. 48. On the morning of January 16, the workers of all departments quit, with the exception of the AFL electricians and machinists who had separate contracts with the management. But forcible persuasion prompted the machinists and electricians to quit also, the IWW reported. On January 17, the plant was completely shut down and 1,500 strikers were picketing to make sure that no scabs got through. 49. Refusing to negotiate, the company rushed to operate with strikebreakers. When the police attempted to escort the scabs into the plant, the strikers and their wives fought back and stopped the first invasion. The company retaliated by ordering the strikers and their families evicted from the company houses, and when the workers resisted, many were clubbed and arrested. But those still on picket duty saw to it that the strikebreakers did not get through. The plant is practically tied up, the Lake County Times wailed on January 19. The following day it announced gloomily, the plant will remain closed for an indefinite period, and it was all due to the fact that the foreigners, hundreds of them, are as sheep led to the slaughter, in the hands of the strike leaders imported from McKees Rocks. 1150 inches. All agitators of the IWW and the socialists ought to be tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail, the same paper cried. Then peace would be restored to Hammond. The strikers reminded the paper that it was because of unbearable working conditions that we are on strike. Thousands are facing the hardships of a cruel winter rather than endure any longer the adversities of unscrupulous employers and their agents. 51. They appealed to Harry Slew, State Labor Commissioner, to investigate the conditions under which they were forced to work. Slew came to East Hammond and conceded that the strikers' grievances were justified. But he refused to lift a finger for them unless they first repudiated the LWW. He assured them he would get the company to sign an agreement if they joined the AFL instead, and declared that the Federation was ready to represent them. He appealed especially to American workers to leave the IWW, which he charged with seeking the overthrow of the government. 52. At a mass meeting on January 23, the strikers, American and foreign-born, unanimously rejected Slew's proposal on the ground that they could only defend their interests through an industrial union which united all workers irrespective £0 craft or nationality. Slew angrily left the city, declaring that he could do nothing for the strikers because of their anarchist tendencies, and that the movement at the Standard plant is more of a socialistic movement than a strike. That same evening, Car Builders Industrial Union No. 301, IWW, issued an appeal to all workers of America and friends, explaining why the strikers had rejected Slew's proposal, and calling for aid in their struggle. All workers arc out and the American workers cannot and will not be separated from their fellow men as hard as the company is trying to accomplish this feat, even using government officials to aid them in this sinister endeavor. United we stand, divided we fall is our motto. Thousands are involved in this struggle, all of different nationalities cemented together against one powerful enemy. Hand in hand, all together is where our brothers at McKees Rocks, and, with your aid, we, too, shall triumph over this Union crusher offspring of the Steel Trust. 3. On January 24, the wives of the strikers organized an anti-scab battalion. The following day, the battalion helped the strikers fight the police to a standstill and prevented the strikebreakers from getting into the plant. Women get into Standard Steel car strike trouble and commit mayhem, shrieked the headline in the Lake County Times. A reporter for the Indianapolis Star wrote, armed with brooms, clubs, stove pokers, rolling pins and other kitchen utensils, hundreds of women from the foreign settlement surrounding the Standard Steel Works today joined the ranks of their striking husbands as pickets and brought about the worst clash that the authorities have yet encountered since the strike began. The women stood with the husbands against the weight of the policemen who tried to open a way to the gate for the workmen going to work. A number of the special police were targets for the broom handles and irons, one of them being severely injured with a long poker that an Amazon had measured across his back. The women held a mass meeting this afternoon and promised to do picket duty again tomorrow morning. The Lake County Times contained a further detail. A woman, whom Officer Borkett was attempting to subdue, bit him on the arm, and had it not been for the heavy coat he wore she would have injured him severely. Emil Hellwig, a special officer, deputized to serve during the strike, was struck over the back with a broomstick by a woman, and when he tried to subdue her she bit his wrist and the flesh is badly lacerated. One woman was shot by the police and 12 were arrested. But the same evening the company sent the mayor and a spokesman for the Hammond Businessmen's Association to the union headquarters to ascertain the terms of settlement. 114. Negotiations between the Strikers Committee and Standard Steel's legal representative resulted in an agreement on January 29 under which all strikers were to be rehired without discrimination. Wages would be increased 10% immediately and another 10% within 60 days. No rents would be charged in the future for company houses when not occupied by the workers, and all back rents due for the period of non-occupancy would be cancelled. All forms of bribery would be abolished, and those found guilty of extorting fees from the workers would be discharged. The workers' grievance committees would be recognized, as would any organization selected by the workers to represent them. 65. The terms of the settlement had just been joyously ratified by the strikers when word came that the company had repudiated the agreement accepted by its representative. The strikers' committee hastened to the plant where H.B. Douglas, general manager, informed them that the company would not accept the 10% immediate wage increase and under no circumstances would recognize committees of the workers or a union of their own choosing. "You can come as individuals as you want to," Douglas declared, "but I cannot and will not recognize the workers as a body." When the committee refused to accept the modifications in the settlement, Douglas vowed to break the strike with scabs, the militia, and, if necessary, federal troops. 116. After leaving Douglas, the committee called a mass meeting of the strikers, who were addressed in English, Hungarian, Croatian, Lithuanian, German, Italian, Russian, and other languages. Whatever the language used, the theme was the same: no backing down. The 1,500 strikers shouted their agreement, and a proposal was made and carried that each striker swear an oath before a crucifix not to go back to work until the fight was finished. John Herman, Secretary of Car Builders Union, No. 301, administered the oath. A reporter described the ceremony. The scene, picturesque and pathetic, could not be reproduced by the most modern stage. The lights of the hall were extinguished. A candle stuck into a bottle was placed on the platform. One by one the 1,500 men, representing 20 separate nationalities, came and kissed the ivory image on the cross, kneeling before it. They swore that they would not scab or go back to work until the company grants the terms it had acceded to when its representative met with a committee of the strikers. 57. The next day, February 1st, the pickets resumed their posts. 2 days later, the company capitulated, and the original settlement, with one modification, was agreed to by both Douglas and the strikers' committee. Grievance committees would be recognized, but the company refused to recognize the workers' union. However, in all matters relating to wages and other conditions, a committee of 3 workers' representatives would meet with a committee of 3 representing management. If the committees failed to agree, the 6th would select a 7th man to arbitrate, and his decision would be final. Although this was a retreat from the original settlement, the strikers agreed with their committee that it was not a fatal weakness, since the 3 men on the workers' committee would always be union representatives, thus opening the door to full union recognition. Since a number of IWW leaders did not regard the question of union recognition as important, they did not view the absence of it from the settlement as a weakness. "Get the union that will get you the goods and you'll have the recognition," a spokesman for this viewpoint pointed out. The modified settlement was accepted by a vote of the strikers. On February 4th, the 1,500 strikers returned to work, and the labor press heralded the news: "Strike at Hammond Car Shops 158. In an editorial entitled, "Lessons of the Strike," the Lake County Times concluded, "The public should make it so hot for intruding agitators whose only interest in a strike is the $3 a day they receive from assessments on the strikers, that they will not dare to put in an appearance again." 59. The real lesson, however, was the same as at McKees Rocks: working-class solidarity and militancy and effective organization could triumph over a powerful corporation. The lesson was brought home even more sharply because of the defeat of a strike at the Standard Steel Car Company's plant at Butler, PA, in July 1909. Here there was no union formed among the strikers, and the American workers deserted the foreign-born and returned without any improvement in conditions. The result was that the company was able to smash the strike with the aid of the state constabulary. 60. But at Hammond, as at McKees Rocks, the IWW built a solid front among the strikers, and not a single worker, American or foreign-born, scabbed during the struggle. The struggle at Newcastle. Meanwhile, at Newcastle, PA, an unusual example of labor solidarity was being exhibited. On June 1, 1909, the American Sheet and Tin Plate Company announced that it would not renew its contracts with the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel and Tin Workers, that all its plants would henceforth be operated as open shops, and that the scale of wages would be reduced by about 3%. Since the mills of the company in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana were the only union plants in the United States Steel Corp., the union prepared for a showdown to maintain what was left of unionism in the Steel Trust. One of its steps was to sign an agreement with the independent manufacturers under which these companies would be allowed to operate in the event of a strike if they signed the scale for 190 grams minus 10. The company and the central office of U.S. Steel in New York refused to even discuss the issue with the union, and on June 30, a strike order was issued. The International Protective Association of Tin Workers, to which the finishers in the company's tin mills belonged, voted to join the strike. On July 1st, 8 sheet and mill workers at all plants of American Sheet and Steel Company, except the one in Cambridge, Ohio, struck. 61. In preparing for the strike, the steel union issued an appeal to the unorganized in the plants to join the walkout. In all 11 plants, the unorganized responded and the mills were tied up. But in 10 of the strike areas, the unorganized, unskilled workers did not have any place to go. The Amalgamated Association had no intention of recruiting them as members, nor did the International Association of Tin Plate Workers. Consequently, the majority of the strikers in these mills were left to drift for themselves, with the result that many soon drifted back to work. 62 At Newcastle, however, every one of the 3,000 workers employed at the company's mill came out on strike, and, with the exception of about 30 men, remained out for over 6 months. The difference between Newcastle and the other strike areas was that in Newcastle a vigorous IWW local existed even before the outbreak of the strike, that it established cordial relations with the other unions in the mills, and worked closely with them. The 3,000 strikers were members of 3 separate unions: the National Protective Association of Tin Workers, Independent, which organized only the finishers; the Amalgamated Association, AF of L, which organized only the other skilled workers; and Local Union No. 28, L. WW, which organized all unskilled workers kept out of the other 2 unions. The majority of the workers employed by the company were thus members of the WW. However, the IWW relief station in Newcastle was open to all strikers, regardless of which union they belonged to, and, in the absence of strike relief from their own union, the members of the Amalgamated Association and their families depended completely on the IWW relief station for food and clothing. 63. 6 weeks after the strike started, the press reported from Newcastle that all 3 organizations are working harmoniously together, a fact which was heralded as the most remarkable news in the American labor scene of the last decade, TT1, and when the Amalgamated Association, through President P. J. McArdle, pledged that the union would not enter into separate negotiations with the company and would maintain a faithful alliance with the Tin Workers Association and the LWW until a conclusion has been reached and an agreement signed with all 3 organizations. The press commented that labor history is being made at Newcastle. 0611 The New York Call urged that steps be taken immediately to establish the same type of unity at the other struck mills of the American Sheet and Tin Plate Company, and that this be followed throughout the entire iron and steel industry. Already the open shop declaration of the Steel Trust in its sheet and tin mills has produced an effect, the very reverse of which the trust has anticipated, and if the common front created by the Tin Workers Protective Association, the Amalgamated Association, and the IWW were to be pursued elsewhere, the result would be a complete amalgamation of all the organizations of the iron and steel industry into one powerful organization that shall be capable of meeting the Steel Trust in something like an established fact. In an interview at Newcastle, late in the strike, Eugene W. Pagenaud, president of the American Sheet and Tin Plate Company, conceded the truth of the Gall's observation. He acknowledged that the workmen here have shown more strength and solidarity than the United States Steel Corporation officials in New York have been given to believe they could show, and that if the same unity were established at the other strike centers, the company would be in real trouble. 66. Unfortunately, the Amalgamated Association did not HNG at the other centers to organize the unskilled workers and keep them in the battle. By September, the strike was broken at all mills except the one in Newcastle where, in the face of a suit for $200,000 brought by the company against union men, in addition to one of the most sweeping injunctions issued up to this time in American labor struggles and daily arrests of the strikers and their wives when they tried to keep the scabs out of the mill, the struggle dragged on through the winter of 1909, IO. As it continued against almost insuperable obstacles, the bitterness of the strikers towards the Amalgamated Association mounted. Resentment against the Amalgamated's leadership for failing to organize the unskilled at the other plants of the company, for not paying strike benefits to its striking members, and for not calling out the independent union mills in support of the workers of the trust-owned mills, was expressed at mass meetings of the strikers. The strikers felt that the independent mills were not truly independent, that they had only signed with the Amalgamated Association to help the Steel Trust break the union and that they would institute the open shop once the strike was lost. There was only one way to meet this strategy, they argued. Every union millman should come out and stay out until the strike was settled. 67. Despite the solidarity and militancy of the Newcastle tin mill strikers, the battle against American Sheet and Tin Plate appeared by mid-October to be heading for the same outcome as had every previous steel struggle since 1901. But this time something new emerged from the struggle. Coming as it did at the same time as the McKees Rocks strike, the Tin Workers strike provided a contrast between the antiquated methods of the Amalgamated Association's craft unionism and the modern methods of the IWW's industrial unionism. And the efforts of the strikers at Newcastle to adjust the old to the new served to emphasize this was an accurate prediction. Once the strike was broken, the independent tin mills broke their contract with the Amalgamated Association and operated as open shops. New York Call, April 15, 1910, Solidarity, April 16, 1910. Ference by pointing out the weakness of the AA's conduct of the strike in other mills. The lesson of the two strikes, the one at the Pressed Steel Car Company and the other at the American Sheet and Tin Plate Company, is the necessity for one union, an industrial union in the iron and steel industry, declared the official organ of the Wheeling, Pa. Trades Assembly. 68. This lesson was being taken to heart by the workers in the industry. A reporter for the New York Call wrote in mid-October 1909 that even though it appeared that the tin mill strike was lost, the spirit of solidarity and organization is growing stronger every day. It is remarkable to note the amount of interest that is being taken in unionism and industrial organization during the last few months in the Pittsburgh district. It had all begun with the victory at McKee's Rocks. Just now remarkable interest is being taken in the IWW. The tin mill workers, also, are taking a deep interest in the IWW. In Newcastle, the IWW, the leaders of which are all Socialist Party members, is growing steadily. Already there are more affiliations for membership in the new organization than there are members in both the amalgamated and protective associations. Greater than J. The accuracy of this report was reflected in the correspondence of the Amalgamated Association's leaders. On October 151, 1909, President McCardle wrote to Frank Morrison, "There is no question but that more and more of the foreign-born workers in the industry are becoming impressed by the vision held out by the industrial unionists, and the victory at McKee's Rocks has given them a strong talking point, so much so, in fact, that even our members are beginning to pay attention to what they say. While it was necessary for us to cooperate with them at Newcastle, we certainly do not look forward to the prospect of their growing influence among the iron, steel and tin workers. I am sure that you share our concern, but it will avail us nothing if we merely bewail these unfortunate developments. We must take steps to prove to the workers that the AFL is capable of winning the strike against the American Sheet and Tin Plate Company and move on to organize all the non-union mills in the industry, and I cannot sufficiently stress the need for immediate action. The time is past when words alone will solve anything, if indeed they ever did." 70. AFL organizers in the steel districts corroborated McCardle's report on the growing influence of the IWW. Emmett Flood, an AFL organizer who had been working with the Amalgamated Association during the steel strike, wrote to Morrison on October 20 that the unorganized men who had joined the battle only to find themselves excluded from the union were extremely bitter and turning towards the IWW for an answer to their problems. "We must do something speedily in this strike to turn the tide in favor of the Amalgamated Association, or the dual unionists will make considerable headway, especially among the Slavs. The IWW-ers are making much of the victory at McKee's Rocks, and we must act to overcome its effects." 71. The AFL could no longer remain indifferent to the struggle in the steel industry, and at a conference in Pittsburgh, December 13, 40 national and international unions recommended that an earnest effort be made to organize all employees in the iron, steel and tin plate industry and subsidiary and correlated industries. But the AFL's campaign to organize steel, geared as it was to craft unionism, ended without any concrete results by the second week in February 1910. The strike against American Sheet and Tin Plate Company dragged on until August 23, 1910, when it ended in miserable failure. Even earlier, a strike against the Bethlehem Steel Company, the largest independent producer and long and open shop citadel, ended in failure. Nothing was left of the craft organization set up by the AFL during the strike. AC.72. Results of organizing drive in steel. By the late spring of 1910, the IWW was the only functioning labor organization in the steel industry. The Federation's campaign, which had opened with the promise that the steel workers would be organized, had closed with the last vestige of AFL unionism in the steel industry eliminated. In McKee's Rocks, however, the IWW Car Builders Industrial Union was still an active, functioning union, a fact attested to by a petition of the businessmen to the Burgess of the city, April 20, 1910, which complained of the continued activities of the Industrial Workers of the World, which is composed principally of foreign-speaking employees of the Pressed Steel Car Company. These professional agitators were continually urging workers of McKee's Rocks to organize and strike for improvements. 73. The IWW had to conduct a continuous struggle against repeated efforts of Pressed Steel Car Company to rob the workers of the fruits of victory. 74. For it soon became obvious that the future of the union at McKee's Rocks was a precarious one as long as the entire steel industry remained unorganized. It was only a matter of time before the giant Steel Trust would concentrate its entire power on eliminating an organization whose, during the Bethlehem strike, a group of the Hungarian and Polish strikers sent a telegram to Joseph Eder inviting him to come to the strike area and bring along men who could speak to the strikers in Hungarian and Polish. None of the AFL organizers could speak these languages. Eder came to Bethlehem with Joseph Schmidt, another IWW organizer, and the two, knowing both languages, did what they could to assist the strike. However, the AFL leaders in the area accused Eder and Schmidt of inciting the strikers to violence, and forced them to leave. John Fairley to Frank Morrison, March 1, 2, 1910, Jacob. Tazelard to Frank Morrison, March 2, 4, 1910, AFL Co. I Solidarity, February 26, March 4, 1910. Existence in one of its subsidiaries would continue to stimulate the steel workers elsewhere. We fear, the one. WW acknowledged, that the powerful forces arrayed against us are likely to drive us out of the field already conquered for the labor movement, 76. Partly to meet this problem, the IWW launched a campaign in July 1910 to organize a national industrial union of all workers in the iron and steel mills of America, which would seek to achieve a general eighth-hour day for all workers in the industry, a minimum wage scale of $2.50 a day for all unskilled workers, abolition of all piece and pool work, a half-day's rest on Saturdays, and abolition of all Sunday work. It was an ambitious project, and in its first call announcing the campaign, the LWW conceded that the organization, which has taken up the enormous work of organizing and educating these downtrodden workers, is of limited resources. 76. The IWW soon learned, however, that lack of finances was not the only obstacle to the success of the campaign. The drive was seriously hampered from the beginning by the hostility of the local officials in the non-union steel towns, and in most communities LWW speakers could not even rent halls for meetings. Again, the LWW found that it was not easy to quickly overcome the anti-hunky prejudice among the skilled American craftsmen. It was all very well for the one WW, in an appeal to the native, to urge the American workers to center your attention on your master. He brought the hunky here. By uniting with the foreigner you can compel the master to grant each and all of you better conditions. But the LWW organizers were compelled to admit that the years of anti-foreigner propaganda of the companies could not be entirely overcome with leaflets alone. It would take actual struggle to teach the American workers the necessity of solidarity. 77. By October 1909 the LWW was forced to concede that, due to the sad experience of the past, the steel workers had grown completely pessimistic and had concluded that it was impossible to make headway against the mighty power of the United States Steel Corp, with its firm control over local and state governments in the steel districts. Not even the story of the victory at McKees Rocks could overcome the demoralizing effects of the great defeats suffered in the strikes at American Sheet and Steel and Bethlehem Steel. 78. All of these factors resulted in the failure of the LWW's campaign to organize the steel workers. As the IWW had feared, the McKees. Another factor was that the IWW was devoting most of its energy and funds in the free speech fights and organizational work among the lumber and agricultural workers of the West. The Wobblies had, as yet, little to spare for the campaign in steel and for the organization of other industries in the East. This tendency to be engrossed in the struggles in the West was reflected in a call from the West to fellow workers of the East, which urged, "Come out West." Rocks Union became the main target of attack by the Steel Trust. In the face of repeated attacks by the company and the police, assisted by the full power of United States Steel, the vigorous solidarity among the victorious steel workers weakened. The English-speaking workers were split away from the foreign-born workers. Disillusionment set in a year after the strike. The Car Builders Industrial Union at McKees Rocks was little more than a paper organization. 79. The experience gained by the IWW in the steel industry in 1909 and L9IO was soon to make itself evident in a different industry. In 1912, the Citizens Association of Lawrence, Mass., distributed a circular letter giving a history of the textile strike in that city, for the purpose of warning other municipalities against the methods of the labor agitators who were behind the strike movement. The circular letter included the following paragraph: that the strike leaders' methods in conducting the Lawrence strike were not new or experimental as shown by the history of the strikes against the Pressed Steel Car Company at McKees Rocks, PA. A study of the conduct of the strikes at McKees Rocks, PA, in 1909 and L9IO reveals the similarity in the methods of the IWW leaders there and in Lawrence during the recent strike. 80. Come by the hundreds of thousands. Start moving from Maine to California. Let us finish them in the West, and then we will all move east. Solidarity, October 7, 19U, March 16, 1912. Car Builders Union No. 301 of Hammond succumbed about the same time.